In the medieval world, wars were rarely decided in a single afternoon of clashing swords. Far more often, power changed hands through silence, patience, and hunger. Cities did not fall because their walls were weak, but because the human body was. A medieval siege was not simply a military operation. It was a slow, grinding contest of endurance, where time itself became a weapon. And for the people trapped inside the walls, it was a descent into starvation that could last months or even years. Medieval cities were built like fortresses for a reason. Thick stone walls, towers, moats, and narrow gates were designed to resist direct assault. Storming a well-defended city was costly and unpredictable. Attackers could lose thousands of men in a single failed assault, only to gain nothing. So commanders learned a cruel lesson early. It was safer to surround a city, cut it off from the world, and wait. Hunger, disease, and despair would do what swords could not. Once a siege began, the first goal was isolation. Roads were blocked, bridges were seized or destroyed, rivers were controlled. Any farmer, merchant, or messenger attempting to enter or leave was captured or killed as a warning. The city became an island, frozen in time, while the besieging army settled into camps around it. Siege warfare was not fast. It was methodical. Trenches were dug. Wooden palisades were raised. Supply lines for the attackers were secured because the side that ran out of food first would lose. Inside the city, life immediately changed. Food was rationed. Grain stores were counted again and again. Officials calculated how long bread might last if each person ate a little less. At first there was discipline. People believed relief would come. Kings, allies, or friendly armies would surely arrive. But as weeks passed, optimism faded. Fresh food disappeared first. Vegetables rotted. Meat vanished. Horses, once symbols of status and power, were slaughtered and eaten. Dogs and cats followed. As the months dragged on, hunger became a constant presence. It was not a sharp pain, but a dull, consuming weakness. Children cried less, not because they were calm, but because they were too weak to cry at all. Adults argued over crumbs. Crime increased. Theft was punished harshly, not only for justice, but to prevent chaos. Bread riots erupted in some cities, forcing leaders to choose between order and mercy. Disease spread quickly in these conditions. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Clean water became scarce. Waste piled up behind walls that could not be cleaned properly. Dysentery, typhus, and plague often killed more people than the enemy ever would. Bodies were buried in shallow graves, or not buried at all. The smell of death hung over besieged cities, a constant reminder of time slipping away. Meanwhile, the attackers waited. Their own lives were uncomfortable, but far less desperate. They had access to surrounding farmland, fresh supplies, and rotation of troops. They passed time with routine, guard duty, weapon maintenance, prayer, and sometimes games. To keep pressure on the city, besiegers used psychological warfare. Prisoners were paraded before the walls. Corpses were flung over ramparts with catapults. In extreme cases, refugees, women, children, the elderly, were expelled from the city by its own leaders to conserve food, only to be trapped between the walls and the enemy, starving in open fields. Siege engines were used not just to break walls, but to break morale. Trebuchets hurled stones day and night, smashing roofs and towers, forcing defenders to stay awake and fearful. Mining operations dug tunnels under walls, threatening sudden collapse. Even when these methods failed, they served a purpose, reminding the city that resistance was temporary. The most terrifying phase came near the end. When food was truly gone, people ate anything that could be swallowed. Leather belts were boiled, shoes were softened over fire. In the darkest moments recorded by chroniclers, cannibalism appeared not as madness, but as survival. Parents faced impossible choices. These stories were whispered long after sieges ended, serving as warnings to future generations. Eventually, surrender became inevitable. City leaders negotiated terms, mercy for citizens, safe passage, or at least protection for churches and children. Sometimes these terms were honoured. Often they were not. A city that resisted too long risked massacre once its gates were opened. Medieval warfare carried a brutal logic. Mercy encouraged resistance elsewhere. Terror discouraged it. Yet not all sieges ended in blood. Some cities survived through careful planning, secret tunnels, or unexpected relief armies. Those that endured became legends, symbols of resilience and faith. But for every famous survival, dozens of forgotten towns quietly disappeared from history, their people erased by hunger rather than battle. Medieval sieges reveal a hard truth about that world. Power belonged to those who could wait. Victory did not always go to the strongest army, but to the one with the deepest patience and the longest supply lines. Walls protected bodies, but they also trapped souls, and hunger, slow, invisible, and relentless, proved to be one of the most effective weapons ever devised. In the end, medieval cities were not conquered by fire alone, they were conquered by time. Now, close your eyes. Let the screen fade into the comfortable dark of your room. Take a slow, deep breath and imagine the light fading from a jagged stone horizon. The air grows cool against your skin, smelling of wood smoke, damp wool, and the coming rain. You are standing on the ramparts of a great city, watching the sun dip below the hills, turning the sky a bruised purple. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, let the darkness settle. We drift backward, 700 years, to the precise moment the world shrinks. The story begins not with a shout, but with a heavy thudding clack. It is the sound of the portcullis dropping, a massive grid of iron and oak slamming into the earth, a sound that vibrates through the soles of your boots and settles in your chest. The large wooden doors behind it are pushed shut by 6 straining men, their grunts echoing in the stone tunnel of the gatehouse. Then comes the grinding of the iron bolt, thick as a man's arm, sliding into its housing. That sound changes everything. An hour ago, this was a city connected to the world. Merchants brought wine from the south, pilgrims wandered in with news of the road, and farmers drove carts of turnips through this very archway. Now, with that single click of the bolt, the city has become an island. It is a stone ship stranded in a sea of grass and mud. You can feel the shift in the air. The bustling noise of the market square below dampens, replaced by a tense, hushed waiting. People stops walking and look toward the walls. A blacksmith sets down his hammer. A mother pulls her child a little closer. The psychological weight of the iron horizon descends. The realization that the horizon no longer belongs to you. It belongs to them. We look out over the parapet, careful to keep our heads low between the crenellations. In the twilight, you can see them gathering. Torches flicker to life in the distance. Hundreds of them, like fireflies, that have decided to land and wait. These are the campfires of the besieging army, forming a ring that chokes the landscape. There is a strange intimacy to this moment. You are not fighting these men, yet you are living with them, separated only by a few hundred yards of empty air and stone. You can hear the faint ring of their hammers as they stake their tents. You can smell their cooking fires, roasting meat that you will not taste. It is a taunt carried on the wind. Historians often debate the true nature of this initial phase. There is a persistent myth that sieges began immediately with boiling oil and arrows raining from the sky. In reality, oil was far too expensive to pour off a wall. It was for cooking or lamps. If defenders poured anything, it was usually boiling water or scorching hot sand, which found its way into the chinks of armour with agonizing efficiency. But most often, the beginning of a siege is defined by bureaucracy, not battle. A herald rides out, his coat of arms bright against the drab field, blowing a horn to demand surrender. It is a legal ritual. If the city opens its gates now, the laws of war, flimsy as they are, dictate mercy. If the bolt remains shut, the city is declared contumacious, stubborn in the eyes of God and the king, and from that moment on, their lives are forfeit. The defenders on the wall look at each other. They know the granaries are full for now. They know the well is deep. There is a bravado in the air, a nervous humour that soldiers use to keep the terror at bay. One guard, wrapping his cloak tighter against the wind, jokes that at least with the gates shut, his mother-in-law cannot visit from the next village. A ripple of laughter moves down the line, soft and brief. It is the last easy laugh they will share for a long time. The night fully descends now. The city behind you turns inward, windows are shuttered. The bells of the cathedral toll for vespers, a mournful, rhythmic clang that seems louder than usual in the confined space. The siege has technically begun, but the violence is deferred. This is the time of the counter-vallation, the technical term for the line of fortifications the attackers will build to lock you in. But to you, standing on the high wall, it just feels like the world has stopped. The stars above look indifferent, shining down on both the trapped and the trappers with the same cold light. You run your hand over the rough, cold stone of the Merlon. This rock is no longer just architecture. It is the only thing standing between you and the end of your world. The silence of the siege is heavy, a blanket of anticipation that suppresses the breath. You are safe tonight, the walls are high, the bolt is thrown. But as you look out at the ring of enemy fires tightening like a noose in the dark, you realise that the walls do not just keep the enemy out, they keep you in. And the waiting, the long, quiet, terrible waiting, has only just begun. The sun rises on the first day of the siege, not with the crow of a rooster, but with the scratching of a quill against dry parchment, a sound that is quieter than a sword being drawn, but far more dangerous. Deep beneath the castle keep, in the cool, vaulted silence of the granaries, the true general of this war is at work. He is not a knight in shining armour, but a steward with ink-stained fingers and a furrowed brow, standing amidst mountains of golden grain that smell of summer fields and dust. The heavy oak doors have shut out the world, and now the city must look inward, turning its gaze to the dark cellars, where the mathematics of survival are being calculated with ruthless precision. This is the moment when the city ceases to be a place of commerce and culture and transforms into a biological equation, a complex algebra of calories, mouths, and days. The steward dips his quill into the ink pot, the black liquid trembling slightly, and begins the tally. It is a scene of profound stillness, yet the tension is thick enough to choke on. He walks the rows of barrels, tapping a knuckle against the wood. Thud, thud, hollow, listening for the pitch that tells him how much salted pork remains. He plunges a wooden scoop into a sack of rye, letting the kernels cascade through his fingers like sand in an hourglass, checking for the dampness that brings mould, or the telltale wriggle of the weevil, the tiny beetle that can hollow out a city's food supply faster than any army. Historians have long noted that the most terrifying weapon in a siege was not the trebuchet but the ledger. A mistake here, a miscount of 50 bushels or a forgotten cask of wine, could mean the difference between holding out until Christmas or surrendering in October. The steward does the mental arithmetic that defines their existence. 5,000 souls within the walls, including the refugees who fled from the countryside with nothing but the clothes on their backs. A medieval adult, working hard, consumed nearly 3 pounds of bread and a gallon of weak ale every single day, a caloric intake that shocks modern sensibilities. The steward writes a number, stares at it, and then scratches it out. That life is over. He writes a smaller number. From today the ration is cut. The mathematics are cold and unforgiving. If they eat their fill, they die in 2 months. If they eat half, they might live for 4. It is a gamble against time, a bet that the King's Relief Army is marching faster than the grain is disappearing. Upstairs in the daylight, the proclamation is read in the market square. The town crier, usually the bearer of gossip or royal birthdays, now reads the new laws of the belly. All private stocks of grain must be declared. Hoarding is punishable by the pillory, or worse. You can see the shift in the eyes of the crowd as they listen. The neighbourliness of yesterday evaporates, replaced by a sudden, sharp suspicion. Did the baker hide a sack of flour under his floorboards? Why does the innkeeper look so well fed? A subtle panic begins to ripple through the streets. Not a chaotic scream, but a quiet tightening of belts. People rush to the markets, but the logic of value has inverted overnight. Gold coins, usually the lifeblood of the city, are suddenly heavy, useless metal. You cannot eat gold. A merchant who, yesterday, would have turned his nose up at a bruised apple, is now eyeing a wheel of hard cheese, with the lust usually reserved for fine silk. There is a dark humour to be found here, if one looks closely. A wealthy, velvet-clad burgher trying to trade a silver candelabra for a sack of turnips, and the turnip seller looking at him with pity, as if he has offered a handful of fog. The currency of the siege is protein and preservation. Salt becomes more precious than sapphires. The city begins to preserve itself. In the kitchens, nothing is wasted. The parts of the animal usually thrown to the dogs, the marrow, the trotters, the ears, are carefully set aside for soups. The smokehouses work overtime, curing everything that can be cured. The sensory experience of the city changes. The smell of roasting meat, usually a sign of a feast, now carries a melancholy undertone, for everyone knows that once this animal is eaten, there will be no more. It is the last harvest. Down in the cellars, the steward continues his grim inventory. He moves to the water cisterns, the black, still pools that reflect the torchlight. Water is life, even more than bread. He drops a pebble in and counts the seconds. It is deep for now, but he knows that a siege is a thirsty business, and if the enemy finds the underground pipes that feed this cistern, the mathematics will change drastically. He marks the level on the stone wall with a piece of chalk, a white line in the damp dark. That line is the high water mark of their hope. As the day wears on, the first meal under the new rationing laws is served. It is not starvation, not yet. It is simply less. The bread is a little denser, mixed with more rye and bran than wheat. The ale is watered down, the stew has more broth than meat. Families sit around their tables, breaking the crusts in silence, chewing slowly to make it last. There is a psychological shift happening in these quiet rooms. They are eating their savings. They are consuming their time. Every bite taken is a minute of survival used up. The children do not understand yet. They ask for more, and mothers have to practice the soft, heartbreaking art of distraction, telling stories instead of serving seconds. The bouche inutile, or useless mouth, a cruel administrative term for those who cannot fight or work, is not yet spoken aloud, but it hangs in the air of the council chambers like a ghost. For now, the city is a single organism sharing its fat, but the steward knows, as he closes his heavy ledger and blows out the candle, plunging the granary back into darkness, that the unity is fragile. The numbers on his page are a countdown. The heap of grain is a sand timer, and the sand has begun to flow. Outside, the enemy campfires flicker again, indifferent to the calculations inside. They have supply lines. They have carts arriving from the countryside with fresh cabbage and fat geese. The contrast is the first psychological blow. Inside, the math of reduction. Outside, the math of abundance. The steward climbs the spiral stairs, his knees cracking, emerging into the cool night air. He looks at the moon, a perfect, unattainable circle of white, and wonders if it looks like a loaf of bread to the hungry men on the watchtower. The siege has only just begun, but in the silence of the granary the end has already been written. It is just a matter of waiting for the ink to dry. While the stoned city holds its breath in the terrifying silence of calculation, the world just outside its walls has exploded into a chaotic, noisy, sprawling carnival of life. If you were to stand on the high ramparts and look down, you would see a mirror image of the city you were trapping, but built of canvas, timber, and mud. This is the siege camp, a city of wood that rises from the earth almost overnight, a temporary metropolis that exists for one purpose, to strangle the permanent one. It is a world of stark contrasts, where the bright, arrogant colours of heraldic flags snap in the wind above a sea of brown sludge. The air here does not smell of fear and rationing. It smells of wet wool, wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the roasting of stolen pigs. A medieval siege army was rarely just a collection of grim soldiers standing in formation. It was a migration, a moving society that brought its own economy, its own laws, and its own chaotic energy to the battlefield. The camp wakes up before the sun. The first sound is not the trumpet, but the coughing of thousands of men in the damp morning mist, and the strike of flint against steel to rekindle the dying fires. Life here is dictated by a strange mix of military discipline and aggressive boredom. The knights and nobles reside in the pavilions, magnificent tents of silk and heavy canvas, dyed in stripes of burgundy and gold, topped with wooden finials and floored with rich carpets to keep the noble feet off the cold ground. Inside these silken palaces, life continues much as it did at court. Wine is poured into silver goblets, greyhounds sleep by the brazier, and commanders argue over maps while servants polish armour that has not yet seen a scratch. But for the common archer or foot soldier, the city of wood is a shanty town of lean-tos, dugouts, and straw mats. They live in the mud, sleep in the mud, and eventually, if the siege drags on, they become part of the mud. The central spine of this temporary city is the market street. It is a historical truth often forgotten that a siege army was a massive consumer, a beast with a ravenous appetite that attracted merchants like flies to honey. Sutlers and traders set up stalls right in the middle of the war zone, selling everything a soldier might need to forget where he is. Dice, dull knives, holy relics of dubious origin, and barrels of campaign ale, a liquid so thick and sour it was often jokingly said to be safer to chew than to drink. There is a bustling economy here where the currency is often looted goods. A silver spoon stolen from a nearby farmhouse might be traded for a warm pair of boots or a fresh wheel of cheese. The noise is constant. The clang of the field smithies repairing horseshoes, the braying of mules, and the rhythmic rasp, rasp, rasp of whetstones, sharpening blades that have nothing to cut but time. Historians often debate the exact ratio of tooth to tail in these armies, the number of fighting men versus the support staff, but it is generally agreed that for every soldier there was at least one non-combatant. These were the camp followers, a term that history has often treated with disdain, painting them merely as vagrants or prostitutes, While those professions certainly existed and thrived in the shadow of the tents, the reality was far more domestic. The camp followers were wives, laundresses, cooks, and priests. They were the logistical backbone that kept the army from collapsing under its own weight. Without the washerwomen scrubbling bloody tunics in the river, disease would have claimed the army in weeks. Without the cooks stirring massive cauldrons of pottage, a thick grey stew of oats, peas, and whatever meat was available, the besiegers would have starved just as slowly as the besieged. Yet, despite the bustle, the dominant emotion of the siege camp is not excitement. It is a crushing, heavy boredom. A siege is a job where you clock in, stare at a wall for 12 hours, and clock out. Men invented endless ways to kill time. They played nine men's Morris, carving the grid into the dirt and using pebbles as pieces. They gambled with obsessive intensity, throwing knuckle bones, sheep vertebrae used as dice, until they had lost their wages, their cloaks, and sometimes their next meal. A common joke among the soldiers was that the only thing harder than the enemy wall was the bread baked in the camp ovens. This soft humour was a survival mechanism, a way to reclaim humanity in a place designed for death. But the idleness was deceptive, for the commanders knew that idle hands make for mutinous thoughts. To keep the men busy, they ordered the construction of the circumvallation, a word that rolls off the tongue like a fortress itself. This was the great irony of the siege. To defeat the wall, the attackers had to build their own. Thousands of men were put to work digging a massive ditch around the entire city, piling the earth up to form a rampart, and driving sharpened wooden stakes into the ground. This ring of fortifications served a dual purpose. It kept the defenders inside, yes, but it also protected the attackers from the outside world. A siege army is vulnerable, pinned against the city, exposed to relief armies that might march over the horizon. So they walled themselves in, creating a donut of fortified earth. It was backbreaking labour, digging in the rain, the mud sucking at boots and shovels, the men grumbling that they had joined the army to swing swords, not to become farmers of dirt. The sanitary conditions of the city of wood were its greatest weakness. In a static camp of 10,000 men and 2,000 horses, waste accumulates with terrifying speed. The latrine trenches, dug on the outskirts, were often overflowing or too close to the water supply. The camp fever, typhus or dysentery, stalked the tent silently. You might wake up one morning to find your messmate shivering with a fever that no shield could block. The smell of the camp was legendary, a miasma of wood smoke, roasting meat, manure, and unwashed humanity that could be smelled miles away, long before the colourful tents came into view. Yet, as evening falls, a strange beauty settles over this muddy city. The fires are lit, thousands of them, glowing like amber beads strung around the neck of the dark landscape. The noise softens into the murmur of tired men. Lutes are plucked, and low, mournful songs drift through the smoke. Songs of home, of girls with yellow hair, of wars that end. From the stone walls of the besieged city, the defenders watch these fires, and from the mud of the camp, the attackers watch the dark silhouette of the towers. It is a staring contest between two cities, one vertical and stone, one horizontal and wood. They are intimately connected, bound together by the invisible thread of waiting. The soldier in the tent wraps himself in his cloak, listening to the rain drumming on the canvas, a hypnotic, rhythmic tapping that is the same sound the king hears in his pavilion and the starving child hears in the tower. They are all sleeping under the same weeping sky. The city of wood is a transient thing, destined to be burned or abandoned when the war ends, leaving only a scar of trampled earth. But for now it is the centre of the world, a place of patience and mud, where men wait for the stone to crack or for the hunger to do the work that their swords cannot. We leave the muddy fields of the encampment now and let the current of history carry us north to where the water is cold, grey and alive with a different kind of terror. The year is 885 and the mist is rising off the river Seine. Here the siege is not a circle of earth around a castle but a blockade of wood against water. We find ourselves in Paris, not the sprawling metropolis of light we know today, but a small desperate island, the Ile de la Cité, huddled in the middle of the river, like a turtle retracting into its shell. In the 9th century, bridges were not merely crossings, they were fortifications, the locked doors of the waterways. Paris possessed two great bridges that tethered the island to the banks, the Grand Pont to the right and the Petit Pont to the left. These low stone and timber spans acted as a physical barrier, a chain stretched across the throat of the river, preventing any ship from sailing further upstream into the heart of France. And coming up that river, riding the dark swell of the tide, was a sight that could freeze the blood of the bravest sentinel. The Vikings had arrived. The chronicler Abbo Cernuus, who watched from the walls with shaking hands, recorded that the river was invisible for miles, covered entirely by the hulls of 700 ships. It was a floating city of dragon heads, their wooden jaws gaping open, painted in red and black, staring hungrily at the stone towers of the bridges. The sheer scale of this fleet is something historians still debate. 700 ships seems an impossible number, a nightmare multiplied by fear, but the effect was undeniable. The river itself had become the enemy. The leader of this floating army, Siegfried, did not want a siege. He wanted passage. He rode to the foot of the bridge and offered a simple bargain to the defenders, Count Odo and Bishop Goselin. Open the bridges, let us sail upriver to plunder the rich, undefended lands of Burgundy, and we will leave Paris untouched. It was a tempting offer. A modern mind might call it pragmatism. A medieval mind called it a deal with the devil. But Odo refused. He understood that the bridges were a trust. To open them was to doom the rest of the kingdom. And so, the negotiations ended, the dragon heads turned toward the walls, and the Battle of the Bridges began. This was a unique form of siege warfare, a clash between the fluidity of water and the stubbornness of stone. The Vikings were masters of engineering, but their genius was mobile. They attacked from the decks of their ships, building high platforms on the masts to rain arrows down upon the defenders. It was a surreal image, men fighting in the sky, suspended above the swirling grey water. The air was filled with the hiss of burning pitch and the frantic shouts of men trying to extinguish fires on the wooden piles of the bridge. Fire was the greatest fear here. A stone wall can stand forever, but a bridge, with its timber supports and narrow walkway, is a fragile thing. The Vikings, frustrated by the stone towers guarding the bridge ends, turned to a terrifying innovation. They filled 3 of their own massive ships with dry wood, tar, and slaughtered carcasses, anything that would burn hot and foul. They set these fire ships ablaze and cast them adrift, letting the current carry the floating infernos toward the wooden supports of the Grand Pont. Imagine standing on the bridge as these burning giants drifted closer, the heat radiating across the water, the smoke obscuring the sun. The defenders watched, helpless, praying that the unpredictable currents of the Seine would be kind. The ships struck the stone piers with a sickening crunch, flames licking up toward the walkway, but the stone held. The river, cool and indifferent, quenched the worst of the fire. The bridge survived, scorched and blackened, a scarred veteran standing thigh-deep in the cold water. The siege settled into a rhythm of tides. When the water was high, the Vikings attacked. When it was low, they waited. But nature is a fickle ally. On a stormy night in February, the Seine rose in a violent flood. The water, swollen with winter rain and debris, tore at the foundations of the petit pont. The wooden supports, weakened by months of hacking and burning, groaned under the pressure. In the dead of night, with a sound like a cracking thunderbolt, the bridge gave way. The connection to the left bank was severed. The tragedy of that night was not just architectural. 12 brave defenders were trapped in the isolated tower on the far bank, cut off from the city they were protecting. They fought until the end, surrounded by water and enemies, a tiny island of resistance that was eventually overwhelmed. The Vikings, seeing the bridge gone, thought they had won. They could now sail through, but the river was choked with the debris of the fallen bridge. Timbers, stones and iron chains lay tangled in the shallows, creating a reef of wreckage that still blocked the path. The bridge, even in death, refused to yield. As the months dragged on, the siege of Paris transformed into a strange aquatic stalemate. The Vikings, unable to break the city, simply camped on the surrounding banks and turned the siege into a blockade. They dragged their lighter ships overland, rolling them on logs past the city to raid the upper river, a feat of brute strength that demoralized the Parisians who watched from the walls. They walked their ships on land like oxen, a guard might have whispered, seeing the impossible sight of sails moving through the fields. Inside the island city, the claustrophobia was intense. Paris is small. You can walk across the Ile de la Cité in 10 minutes. Crammed with refugees, livestock and soldiers, the island became a stifling cage. The river, usually a source of life, became a taunt. Water everywhere, but dangerous to fetch, for Viking archers waited on the banks. The psychological toll of being surrounded by water, unable to step off the island without dying, created a unique kind of weariness. It was not just the hunger, it was the dampness, the fog that never lifted, the mould that grew on boots and bread alike, the sound of the river lapping against the stone, a constant rhythmic reminder that they were adrift. Historians often focus on the battles, but the true story of the siege of Paris is found in the quiet moments of the blockade. It is found in the image of Bishop Goslin organising processions of relics along the walls, holding up the bones of saints to the grey sky, hoping for a miracle that came in the form of an eel caught in a net or a sudden rainstorm that doused a fire. It is found in the soft humour of the archers who named the Viking ships. There goes the rotten tooth. Here comes the drunken goose, trying to reduce the terrifying dragon prows to something mundane and manageable. It is found in the specific texture of the Seine mud, sticky and grey, which coated everything and everyone, blurring the lines between king and commoner. Eventually, the siege ended, not with a glorious charge, but with a transaction. The Emperor Charles the Fat arrived, not to fight, but to pay. He gave the Vikings 700 pounds of silver to leave, a darngeld that tasted like ash in the mouths of the Parisians who had fought for a year. The city had held, but the victory felt hollow. Yet as the dragon ships finally turned their prows westward and drifted back toward the sea, leaving the scarred bridges and the battered island behind, something had changed. The myth of Viking invincibility had been chipped just a little by the stone of the bridges. The city had proven that it could be an island without being a coffin. The river flowed on, washing away the blood and the ash, scrubbing the stones clean with the patience that only water possesses. The bridges were rebuilt stronger this time, with the memory of the fire baked into their foundations. And tonight, if you listen closely to the sound of a river flowing in the dark, you can almost hear the creak of the oars and the heavy, wet thud of wood against stone, echoing from a time when the water itself was a war. The war does not always rage in the sunlight. Sometimes it creeps into the very foundation of the world, hiding in the cool, suffocating dark beneath the grass. If you were to walk the perimeter of a besieged castle, stepping carefully over the mud and debris, you might feel safe as long as the arrows weren't flying. But in the late medieval era, the most terrifying sound was not the scream of a catapult, but a faint, rhythmic scratching coming from deep below the soles of your boots. The ground beneath you was not solid, it was a weapon. We are descending now into the realm of the sapper, the miner, the soldier who fought his war on his knees, in tunnels barely wider than his shoulders, breathing air thick with dust and the fear of sudden burial. This was the silent war, a claustrophobic nightmare of engineering and nerves that turned the earth itself into a traitor. The logic of the mine was simple and devastating. Stone walls are heavy. They rely on the earth to hold them up. If you remove the earth, gravity, the one force that never surrenders, will do the rest. The process began far back in the attacker's camp, well out of bowshot. A discreet hole would be dug, often hidden behind a wooden screen or a tent, to mask the pile of fresh dirt accumulating like a molehill. From this opening, a team of specialist miners would burrow forward. These men were a breed apart. They were not knights seeking glory, they were often actual miners from tin or silver mines, paid a king's ransom to trade the danger of a cave-in for the danger of a counterattack. They worked in shifts, digging 24 hours a day, guided only by the flicker of a tallow candle and the crude compass of their own intuition. The tunnel, or sap, was a masterpiece of temporary architecture. As they dug, they shored up the roof with sturdy wooden beams, great trunks of oak or elm dragged underground. This was the prop. The miners were literally building a wooden floor for the castle wall to rest on, swapping the stone foundation for timber, foot by perilous foot. It was quiet work. A shout could echo and alert the enemy. A struck rock could ring like a bell. So they spoke in whispers, their world reduced to the smell of damp clay, the sweat of the man in front of you, and the constant, oppressive weight of the world hanging just inches above your head. The air grew stale and hot the deeper they went. Canaries or caged birds were sometimes brought down, not for company, but as early warning systems for bad air, the silent pockets of gas that could kill a man before he even realized he was suffocating. Inside the castle, the defenders were not oblivious. They knew the signs. The first defense against the mine was listening. It is a historical image of profound tension. A veteran soldier sitting alone in a deep cellar, staring intently at a bowl of water placed on a drumhead. If the water rippled when no one was walking, or if the peas placed on the drumhead began to dance, the enemy was underneath. The medieval seismograph was a basin of water and a terrified ear. Once the vibration was confirmed, the panic set in. You cannot fight an enemy you cannot see. The walls, once symbols of strength, suddenly felt precarious. The very stones seemed to hold their breath. If a mine was detected, the defenders had only one option, the countermine. They had to dig their own tunnel, frantically burrowing out from the cellar to intercept the enemy tunnel before it reached the wall. This led to the most horrific combat known to medieval warfare. Imagine the moment the two tunnels met. The wall of earth between them thins, crumbles, and suddenly breaks. Light meets darkness. There is no room to swing a sword. There is no room to stand. Men fought on their bellies, stabbing with daggers, hacking with pickaxes, strangling each other in the pitch black, choking on the dust of the collapse. It was a brawl in a grave. Historical records whisper of camouflages, small explosive charges or smoke bombs used to suffocate the enemy in these cramped burrows. To die in the sunlight is one thing. To die buried in the dark, trapped in a collapsed tunnel with your enemy, was a fear that kept even the bravest knights awake. But if the countermine failed, or if the digging went unnoticed, the sappers would reach their destination. The corner of the great tower. They would widen the chamber, replacing the foundation stones with a forest of wooden props. The tower was now standing on stilts, floating on a cushion of wood. Then came the final phase, the firing. The miners would pack the spaces between the timbers with straw, brushwood, and the secret ingredient of the siege, pig fat. Barrels of rendered pork fat were rolled into the tunnel to act as an accelerant. It is a strange domestic detail in a war of stone. The smell of a siege was often the smell of bacon. When the order was given, the miners would light the fuse and run. As the fire took hold, the wooden props would burn. Slowly, the structural integrity would turn to ash. Above ground, the waiting army would watch the tower. It rarely exploded. Instead, it was a slow, majestic, terrifying slump. The corner of the castle would simply sink, as if the earth had opened its mouth to swallow it. The masonry would groan, a sound like a dying giant, and then crack, the stones cascading down in a cloud of dust that obscured the sun. The breach was open. Historians still debate the effectiveness of mining compared to surface artillery. While trebuchets were visible and intimidating, the psychological terror of the mine was superior. The mere rumour that they are digging could force a surrender. It broke the trust between the defender and the ground. At the siege of Rochester in 1215, King John famously ordered the digging of a mine under the keep and requested 40 of the fattest pigs of the sort, least good for eating, to burn the props. The tower fell, not to the strength of the king's arm, but to the fat of the pig and the patience of the mole. Even when the tunnel was empty, it remained a scar. Years later, people would walk over the green depressions in the earth, unaware that beneath the grass lay the ghost of a tunnel, a hollow vein where men once held their breath and listened for the scratching of doom. The mine reminds us that in a siege, safety is an illusion. You can build your walls as high as the clouds, but if you do not watch the darkness beneath your feet, the earth itself will be your undoing. The dust settles now on the collapsed tunnel. The silence returns to the underground and the war moves upward, from the depths of the soil to the arc of the sky, where a new and heavier threat is preparing to fly. We rise now from the suffocating dark of the tunnels to the open air, where the sky itself is about to become a threat. If you were to look out from the battlements in the grey light of dawn, you would see them rising in the distance like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts. These are the trebuchets, the undisputed kings of medieval artillery. They are not merely machines, they are monuments to the terrifying power of gravity. Unlike the frenetic energy of a sword fight, the trebuchet operates with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. It creates a war of anticipation, where death arrives not with a scream, but with a creak, a swing, and a heavy, crushing thud. The engineering of the counterweight trebuchet was a revolution in physics. Before this, engines relied on tension, twisted ropes or bent wood like giant bows. But the trebuchet harnessed the fundamental force of the planet. Imagine a massive wooden beam balanced on a high fulcrum like a seesaw. On the long end, a sling holds the projectile, a stone the size of a man's torso. On the short end hangs a colossal wooden box, the counterweight, filled with tons of lead, rocks, or tightly packed earth. The logic is elegant and brutal. To send the stone up, the heavy box must fall down. It is a weapon powered by the earth's desire to pull things close. The loading process was a slow, laborious ritual that the defenders on the wall had to watch, helpless to intervene. A team of men, sometimes numbering in the dozens, would turn great winches to haul the long arm down. Click, 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 click. The sound of the ratchet would drift across the field, a mechanical countdown ticking away the seconds of peace. The counterweight box would rise into the air, trembling with potential energy, hovering there like a suspended anvil. It was a performance of stored violence. The engineers, the magisters of the siege, would fuss over the machine with the obsessive detail of watchmakers, adjusting the angle of the release pin or smoothing the leather of the sling. There is a soft, dark humour in watching these men work. They treat this instrument of destruction with the tenderness one might show a prize-winning pumpkin, padding the beams and whispering to the ropes. Then the command, "Loose." The trigger is struck. The heavy box drops. Gravity takes over. The long arm swings up, accelerating with a terrifying whoosh that tears the air. The sling whips around the tip of the beam, extending the lever arm at the last possible second to maximize speed, a snap of the wrist on a godly scale. The stone is released at the apex of the arc, soaring high into the blue. For the people inside the city, this is the most psychological part of the bombardment. Unlike a bullet, which is too fast to see, or an arrow, which is a blur, you can see the trebuchet stone. It hangs in the sky for a long, breathless moment, a dark sphere growing larger against the clouds. You have time to think. You have time to calculate. Is it coming for the tower, the gate, or is it coming for my roof? It is a slow-motion terror. Experienced soldiers claimed they could judge the trajectory and step aside, casually watching the stone smash into the pavement 5 yards away. But for the civilians, every rock looked like it was aimed at their own hearts. The impact, when it comes, is not an explosion, but a shattering. The stone does not just hit, it pulverizes. Roofs collapse in a cloud of slate and timber. Battlements are sheared off, as if by a giant chisel. The sound is a deep, resonant crump that vibrates in the teeth. And then the silence returns. The dust settles, and faintly, from the enemy camp, the winches begin to turn again. Click, click, click. The cycle restarts. History gives us a vivid glimpse of this obsession in the story of King Edward VI of England and his monstrous creation, the war wolf, loup de guerre. At the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, Edward commanded his engineers to build the largest trebuchet the world had ever seen. It took 3 months and 50 carpenters to construct. It was so massive that the sight of it rising against the skyline was enough to break the defenders' will. They offered to surrender. They opened the gates. But Edward, a man of terrifying curiosity, refused the surrender. He had not built the war wolf just to look at it. He wanted to see it work. He ordered the defenders back inside the castle so he could throw a rock at them. It is a moment of absurdity that captures the medieval mind. The war must pause for the science experiment. The war wolf fired, and the chroniclers say the massive stone smashed through the gatehouse and crushed the curtain wall as if it were made of sugar. Only then was the surrender accepted. But the trebuchet was not always used to knock down walls. Sometimes it was used to send a message. When ammunition ran low, or when cruelty ran high, besiegers would load the sling with other things: dead horses, the heads of executed prisoners, manure. In a grim precursor to biological warfare, they would hurl beehives or baskets of venomous snakes over the walls, turning the city streets into a chaotic obstacle course. There is a specific bizarre horror in walking down a street and having to dodge a flying cow. These messengers were designed to spread disease and fear, to remind the people inside that there was no roof strong enough to hide them. Night bombardments were the worst. The attackers would wrap the stones in rags soaked in pitch and set them alight. These fireballs traced glowing arcs across the black sky, beautiful and deadly comets. They were not aimed at the stone walls, which could not burn, but at the thatched roofs and wooden stables inside the city. A city at night is a flammable thing. The defenders would have to rush with buckets of water and sand, fighting fires while the next rock was already in the air. Sleep became impossible. The rhythm of the machines, the thump of the release, The whistle of the flight, the crash of the impact, became the heartbeat of the night. Sleep deprivation, the white torture of the Middle Ages, wore down the defenders' resolve faster than hunger. Historians often debate the accuracy of these machines. Movies show them hitting the same brick twice, which is largely a myth. The trebuchet was an area effect weapon, a shotgun rather than a sniper rifle, but its inaccuracy was part of the terror. You didn't know where it would hit. It turned the entire city into a zone of probability. The engineers adjusted the counterweight with buckets of gravel, trying to dial in the range, but the wind and the wear of the ropes made every shot a gamble. As the sun sets on the battered city, the silhouette of the trebuchet remains, standing still against the twilight. It looks peaceful now, its long arm pointing up at the first star. But everyone knows that tomorrow, the gravity will return. The physics will not tire. The counterweight will always want to fall. The walls may be thick and the gates may be barred, but the sky is open and the enemy has found a way to make the mountains fly. The stone settles in the rubble, cooling in the night air, a silent testament to the day the earth shook. And as the dust clears, the city realizes that while the walls can stop men, they cannot stop the weight of the world falling upon them. The dust from the trebuchet impact settles, drifting down through the dry air to coat the cobblestones in a fine grey powder. But as the ringing in the ears fades, a new and more insidious silence begins to spread through the city. It is the silence of the dry fountain. We move now from the terror of the sky to the terror of the throat, entering the phase of the siege where the most precious substance on earth is no longer gold or iron, but water. Hunger is a slow companion, a lethargic guest that stays for months, allowing men to weaken gradually while keeping their minds relatively clear. But thirst is a frantic, screaming intruder. It works fast. The human body, a vessel made mostly of seawater, can only survive a few days without replenishment before the mind begins to unravel. The commanders outside the walls know this biological clock better than anyone. One of the first strategic moves in any siege, often done before the first arrow was knocked, was the breaking of the aqueducts. In the ancient and medieval worlds, cities were often fed by these stone arteries, bringing cool fresh water from the distant hills. The besiegers would locate these veins and sever them, smashing the clay pipes or diverting the streams into the mud. Inside the city, the sound of rushing water, the background music of urban life, would suddenly stop. The public fountains, usually bubbling with the gossip of washerwomen and the laughter of children, would dwindle to a trickle, then a drip, and finally a dry, dusty stone basin. The city, cut off from the mountain springs, was forced to look down into the dark, still eyes of the cisterns and wells. Here, the siege shifts from a battle of soldiers to a battle of stewardship. The water bailiff becomes the most powerful man in town, more feared than the sheriff. He stands guard over the communal well, armed not with a sword, but with a ladle and a list. The rationing of water is a delicate, heartbreaking calculus, a cup for a man fighting on the walls, half a cup for a mother, a wet rag to suck on for a child. The sensory world of the besieged narrows down to the sensation of moisture. The air feels aggressively dry. The stone walls seem to bake in the sun, radiating heat that sucks the moisture from the skin. People stop talking to conserve saliva. The city becomes a place of whispers, not out of secrecy, but out of physical necessity. It simply costs too much to shout. There is a profound historical irony in the fact that many castles were built on high, rocky crags for defence, places that are naturally dry. The very height that makes them hard to storm makes them hard to water. Deep wells were dug through solid rock, feats of engineering that took decades. But even these deep roots could fail. Historians often debate the effectiveness of dowsing or water divining in these moments of crisis. Did medieval engineers really rely on a twitching hazel twig to find water, or was it a misunderstanding of their knowledge of geology? Regardless of the method, the discovery of a new spring within the walls was treated as a miracle greater than a victory in battle. Bells would ring, and people would weep, not with tears, they had none to spare, but with relief. But when the wells ran low, the water changed. It became thick. The level dropped into the silt and mud at the bottom. The bucket would come up bringing a brown, opaque liquid that smelled of the earth's bowels. Soldiers would strain it through their cloaks, trying to filter out the grit and the wriggling larvae, but the taste of stagnation remained. It was the taste of a coffin. To drink it was to gamble with dysentery, the bloody flux that killed more armies than any weapon. Yet the thirst was always stronger than the fear. Men would trade their family heirlooms, silver rings and velvet coats, for a single cask of clean rainwater. There is a dark, soft humour to be found in the wine cellars of the rich. A merchant might sit surrounded by barrels of the finest vintage Bordeaux, worth a fortune in peacetime, yet he would gladly trade it all for a bucket of muddy river water. Wine dehydrates the body. The luxury of the peace becomes the poison of the siege. The psychological toll of thirst manifests in dreams. Chroniclers tell us that during the great droughts of sieges, the defenders did not dream of food or women or victory. They dreamed of rivers, they dreamed of standing neck-deep in cold, rushing currents, of rainstorms that never ended, of waterfalls crashing onto their faces. They would wake up, licking the rough stone of the wall, hoping to find a bead of morning dew. The besiegers, cruel in their abundance, would sometimes taunt the city with water. They would bathe their horses in the river within sight of the walls, splashing the precious liquid onto the ground, letting the dry earth drink what the children inside could not. It was a torture of proximity. The cure for their dying was right there, flowing past, just out of reach. In the most desperate moments, the useless mouths, the livestock, were sacrificed not for their meat, but for their fluids. The blood of horses was mixed with vinegar and drunk, a metallic, grim cocktail of survival that sat heavy in the stomach. But the darkest fear was not running out, but being poisoned. A sudden sickness sweeping through the garrison was often the sign that the enemy had thrown a carcass into the source. The poisoned well is a trope of fairy tales, but in siege warfare it was a terrifying reality. It turned the act of drinking into a game of Russian roulette. Yet, in this arid despair, there were moments of profound human tenderness. A soldier on the ramparts, seeing a bird land on the battlement with its beak open, might share a drop from his flask, recognizing a shared suffering in the tiny creature. A mother might press a damp sponge to a feverish child's forehead, sacrificing her own ration to cool his skin. These small acts of moisture were acts of defiance against the dryness of death. The rain, when it finally came, was a religious event. You can imagine the scene, the first grey clouds gathering over the starving city, the smell of ozone and wet dust, petrichor, filling the air. The fighting stops, the politics stop. Everyone, attacker and defender alike, looks up. When the first drops fall, the people of the city rush out. They spread sheets of canvas, upturn helmets, place pots and pans on the roofs. They stand, with their mouths open to the sky, letting the heavens wash the dust from their tongues. For a brief hour, the siege is forgotten. There is only the rain. It is a universal baptism, washing away the sins of the war, if only for a moment. But the clouds eventually pass, the sun returns, the puddles dry up, and the city is left once again with the silence of the empty cup. The thirst returns, sharper this time, for having been briefly quenched. As we leave the parched throats of the defenders, we realise that the most effective wall is not made of stone, but of deprivation. The enemy does not need to climb the ramparts. They only need to wait for the well to run dry. The stone of the cistern remains cold and damp to the touch, a cruel memory of where the water used to be, while outside the river flows on, indifferent to the thirst of the history being made on its banks. From the dark, dry depths of the well, we climb now to the dizzying heights of the limestone cliffs in Normandy, where the wind whips the hair across your face and the world stretches out in a panorama of river and forest. We stand before the saucy castle, Chateau Gaillard. If medieval sieges were a contest between the shield and the sword, this castle was the ultimate shield, built by Richard the Lionheart in a feverish frenzy of just 2 years. It was designed to be not just a fortress, but a statement of arrogance carved in stone. Richard famously boasted that he could hold this castle even if its walls were made of butter. It represented the pinnacle of military engineering, a machine of war so advanced that it seemed to mock the very idea of a siege. Yet we are here to witness its fall, a story that proves that even the most perfect armour has a chink if you look closely enough. The year is 1204. Richard, the warrior king, is dead, and his brother John sits on the English throne, far away. The man staring up at the white walls from the mud below is Philip Augustus, the King of France, a man who fights with his mind as much as his sword. He knows he cannot storm Chateau Gaillard. The castle is a series of concentric rings, a nesting doll of defences. To take the keep, you must take the inner bailey. To take the inner bailey, you must take the middle. To take the middle, you must take the outer. It is a mathematical impossibility of death zones. The walls are not flat, but scalloped, curved like the edge of a cloud, so that an arrow striking them would ricochet unpredictably, and there were no blind spots for the defenders to hide in. It was a masterpiece. But Philip was patient. He settled in for the starvation winter. He wrapped the castle in a double line of trenches and waited. The cold of 1204 was brutal. The sand froze. The defenders, led by the brave Roger de Lacy, watched their breath mist in the air, confident in their stone shell. They had food, they had water, they had the ghost of Richard watching over them. But sieges are rarely won by attacking the strong points. They are won by finding the absurd tiny oversights that architects forget. The first layer, the outer bailey, fell to a mine, a callback to the terror of the underground war we have seen. But the middle bailey stood firm. It was protected by a sheer ditch cut into the living rock, 30 feet deep. There was no bridge, there was no way across. The French army sat on the edge of the ditch, staring at the smooth, vertical walls of the middle ward, frustrated by the perfection of the design. It seemed the siege would stall here until every defender had died of old age. And then a soldier named Ralph, or perhaps Peter, the chronicles are hazy on the name of the man, but clear on his deed, looked up. He was scouting the base of the wall, perhaps looking for a place to relieve himself, when he noticed something. High up on the wall, near the chapel, there was a small unguarded opening. It was the outlet of a chute. Here lies one of the great, somewhat undignified debates of military history. For centuries, the popular story has been that this opening was a latrine chute, a garderobe. The narrative is grimly ironic. The impregnable castle was penetrated through its toilet. It fits the medieval sense of humour, the idea that the highest pride falls through the lowest filth. However, modern historians and architects examining the ruins argue that it was likely a low window for the chapel or a storeroom, designed to let in a little light or dispose of refuse, not necessarily sewage, But whether it was a window or a drain, the result was the same. It was a hole in the armour. Under the cover of a moonless night, Ralph and a small group of hand-picked men crept into the ditch. The silence was absolute, save for the wind whistling through the valley. They began to climb. It was not a climb for the faint of heart. It was a desperate scramble, up slippery limestone, fingers digging into moss and cracks, boots scraping quietly against the sheer face. If they fell, they died. If they were seen, they died. They reached the opening. It was narrow, tight, and dark. One by one, they squeezed through, contorting their bodies, dragging their swords behind them. Imagine the moment they tumbled out onto the floor of the room inside. They were in the heart of the enemy fortress, behind the unbreachable walls. They were not an army. They were a handful of men with dirty faces and racing hearts. But they had the element of chaos on their side. They drew their weapons and began to scream. They ran through the dark corridors of the Middle Bailey, shouting, banging on doors, setting fires to straw pallets. They created the illusion of a massive breach. The defenders on the walls panic. In the confusion of the night, the flicker of fire and the sound of enemy voices inside the perimeter broke their psychological resolve. They assumed the wall was down. They assumed they were overrun. They abandoned their posts and retreated to the inner keep, the final shell of the nesting doll. In their haste, they left the drawbridge down, or perhaps the infiltrators managed to lower it. The French army, waiting outside, poured across the ditch like a flood. The Middle Bailey, the engineering marvel that had defied an army, was lost because of a single unbarred window and a few men willing to climb in the dark. Now, only the inner keep remained. It was the jewel of the castle, shaped like the prow of a ship, a pointed beak of stone designed to deflect missiles. But the defenders were shaken. Their confidence in the butter walls was shattered. The French brought up their siege engines to the very door of the keep. They began to mine the last foundation. The end came not with a heroic last stand, but with the collapse of will. The walls were breached. The defenders, exhausted, starving, and disillusioned by the failure of their perfect fortress, surrendered. The fall of Chateau Gaillard sent a shockwave through Europe. It was the Titanic of the 13th century, the unsinkable ship that sank. It signalled the end of the Angevin Empire in Normandy. King Philip had won not just a castle, but a kingdom. But for the student of history, the lesson is more intimate. It is a reminder that in the grandest designs of men, there is always a flaw. We build towers to touch the sky, but we forget to lock the cellar window. We focus on the thickest walls and the deepest moats, ignoring the humble drainpipe. Today, Chateau Gaillard still stands, though it is a broken tooth on the skyline. The wind blows through the empty windows of the keep, and the grass grows in the ditch where the infiltrators once climbed. It is a beautiful, melancholic ruin, a white skeleton bleaching in the sun. If you sit there quietly, listening to the rustle of the trees, you can almost feel the ghost of Richard's arrogance fading into the reality of John's failure. The stone is cold under your hand. It feels permanent, eternal. But the story whispers the truth. Nothing we build is truly safe. The castle did not fall to the trebuchet or the ram. It fell to the curiosity of a soldier who looked up when everyone else was looking down. The night returns to the valley now, covering the ruins in shadow, and we move on, leaving the empty shell of pride behind. For a new and darker enemy is approaching, one that does not need a window to enter, for it is carried in the very air we breathe. We leave the crumbled limestone of Normandy and let the winds of history carry us thousands of miles to the east, to the edge of the known world, where the Black Sea laps against the Crimean coast. The year is 1346. The air here is heavy, humid, and smells of salt, spices, and something else. Something sweet and rotting that catches in the back of the throat. We are standing on the walls of Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony that clings to the coast like a barnacle. Kaffa is a city of merchants, a place where the Silk Road ends and the sea begin, a bustle of languages and coins and exotic goods. But now, the gates are barred, and the city is under siege by the Golden Horde, the vast Mongol army that has swept across the steppe like a grass fire. But this is not a normal siege. If you look out at the Mongol camp, you do not see the orderly drills of soldiers or the frantic digging of sappers. You see stillness. You see a landscape of strange, frantic despair. The enemy is not attacking. The enemy is dying. A mysterious pestilence has arrived from the deep east, a silent traveller riding on the backs of rats and in the blood of fleas. It is a sickness that begins with a fever and ends with black swellings, the buboes in the armpits and groin. The Mongol warriors, men who have conquered empires, are falling by the thousands without a sword being drawn. Jani Beg, the Mongol commander, watches his army dissolve. He is furious, he is helpless, he cannot fight a microbe, but in his anger he conceives of a final, horrific act of spite, a decision that will change the course of human history forever. He orders his men to gather the fresh corpses of the plague victims. He orders the trebuchets to be loaded. This is the moment where medieval warfare crosses a terrifying line. We have seen stones, fire, and dead horses thrown at walls. But now, the sky above Kaffa fills with a darker rain. The defenders on the walls look up, expecting the crash of granite. Instead, they hear the wet, sickening thud of human bodies. The dead are flying. It is a scene of nightmare. The limp forms of soldiers, turning in the air, clearing the ramparts to land in the streets, on the roofs, in the market squares. Jani Beg is not trying to break the walls. He is trying to export his sickness. He is sharing the plague. The people of Kaffa retreat in horror. They interpret this not as biological warfare, a concept they do not have, but as a spiritual pollution. They believe the miasma, the bad air released by the rotting bodies, will kill them. And in a way, they are right, though the mechanism is different. The fleas, confused and hungry, as their hosts grow cold, jump from the dead bodies to the living defenders, and to the rats that scurry in the shadows of the city. Historians and epidemiologists still argue fiercely about this moment. Was this truly the patient zero event for the Black Death in Europe? Some scholars suggest that the plague was already present in the local rodent population, that it would have entered the city through the rats on the grain ships regardless of the flying corpses. They argue that the walls of a city are no barrier to a rat. But whether the catapults were the primary cause or just a gruesome spectacle, the psychological impact was absolute. The city was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb. The very air felt poisonous. The water in the cisterns seemed tainted. Panic, the constant companion of the siege, mutated into a frantic need to escape. The Genoese merchants, practical men who understood the value of a life, decided to cut their losses. They looked to the harbour. The Mongol army was too sick to stop the ships from leaving. The blockade had crumbled along with the soldiers. And so, the great galleys were prepared. This is a tragic irony of the siege of Kaffa. The moment of escape was actually the moment of doom. The sailors loaded their chests of silk, their barrels of spices, and their families onto the wooden ships. They believed they were leaving the death behind. They hoisted the sails, catching the wind that blew toward Italy, toward home. As the ships pulled away from the dock, leaving the doomed city of Kaffa fading into the mist, the sailors breathed a sigh of relief. They were safe. The blue water of the Black Sea opened up before them, promising life, but they did not know what they were carrying. Down in the dark, damp holds of the ships, amidst the sacks of grain and the coils of rope, the rats were nesting. And on the rats were the fleas. And in the fleas was the bacteria Yersinia pestis. The ships were not arks of survival, they were delivery systems for the apocalypse. The voyage home was a slow-motion horror story. One by one, the sailors began to cough. The fever took them. The black boils appeared. By the time the ships reached Constantinople, then Messina in Sicily, then Genoa and Venice, they were ghost ships drifting into harbour with crews that were half dead or delirious. The dock workers, who rowed out to meet them, thinking they were greeting friends and business partners, were greeting the end of their world. The siege of Kaffa had ended, but the siege of Europe had just begun. The plague that landed with those ships would go on to kill perhaps half the population of the continent. It would empty cities, silence cathedrals, and change the social structure of the world forever. But let us return to Kaffa for a moment before the ships vanish over the horizon. The city itself eventually fell, but not to the assault. It fell to the silence. The Mongols, too sick to occupy it, largely abandoned the effort. The city was left as a hollow shell, a place where the wind whistled through empty houses, and the only movement was the scurrying of the creatures that had inherited the earth. There is a profound melancholy in imagining the last days of Kaffa, the goods sitting unsold in the stalls, the gold coins lying untouched on the tables, the complete cessation of the human struggle for profit and power in the face of a simple, invisible organism. The story of Kaffa teaches us that a siege is not always a binary contest between two armies. Sometimes there is a third participant, nature itself, which cares nothing for flags or kings. The walls of Kaffa were high and the merchants were rich, but neither stone nor gold could stop the microscopic invasion. It is a reminder of the fragility of the human fortress. We build our defences against what we can see, the arrow, the sword, the battering ram, but we are often undone by what we cannot. As the Genoese ships disappear into the grey blur of the horizon, carrying their terrible cargo toward the unsuspecting ports of the Mediterranean, the narrative of the siege shifts. It is no longer about staying in. It is about the impossibility of keeping things out. The boundaries of the world are dissolving. The isolation that the siege masters tried to enforce, the iron horizon we spoke of in the beginning, has been breached, not by an army, but by a disease. The world is connected, for better or for worse. The bacteria travels the same trade routes as the silk. The death travels with the life. We watch the wake of the ships frothing white in the dark water, a temporary scar on the sea that heals almost instantly. The screams of Kaffa fade. The groans of the dying Mongols fade. All that is left is the sound of the waves, rhythmic and eternal, washing against the hull of the ship that is bringing the nightmare home to sleep. The sun sets over the Black Sea, turning the water the colour of a bruise, and we drift away, leaving the tragedy of the East behind, to see what happens when the fire itself becomes the weapon and the water burns. The wind shifts now, turning from the cold, pestilent breeze of the Black Sea to a warm, sulphurous gust blowing off the Golden Horn. We travel back in time, yet stay near the water, arriving at the greatest city of the medieval world, Constantinople. It is night. The moon is hidden behind heavy clouds, making the waters of the Bosporus indistinguishable from the black sky. You are standing on the deck of a wooden warship, part of a massive Arab fleet that has come to strangle the Roman Empire in its crib. The city walls loom in the distance, dark and silent. You expect arrows. You expect stones. You expect the dull thud of a ram. But the Byzantines have prepared something else, a weapon so terrifying that its very name will become a legend, a technology so advanced that it borders on magic. They call it sea fire or Roman fire. We know it as Greek fire. The silence of the water is broken not by a shout, but by a strange mechanical hissing, like the breath of a waking dragon. From the prow of a small, fast Byzantine ship, a droman, a bronze tube extends like a finger-pointing judgment. Behind it, men are working a complex pump, sweating in the heat of a furnace hidden below decks. Suddenly, with a roar that chroniclers compared to thunder, a jet of liquid shoots from the tube. It does not arc like water. It catches fire the moment it touches the air. A stream of liquid gold tears through the night, illuminating the terrified faces of the sailors. It strikes the hull of your ship. And this is where the nightmare begins. You grab a bucket of water, the sailor's instinct, and throw it on the flames. But the fire does not hiss and die. It roars louder. It spreads. The water acts as a conductor, carrying the burning liquid across the deck, into the rigging, onto the clothes of the men. This is the horror of Greek fire. It burns on water. The sea itself turns into a carpet of flames. Panic, absolute and primal, takes over. Men dive overboard to escape the heat, only to find themselves swimming in fire. The air fills with the smell of burning resin, pitch, sulphur, and something sharp and chemical. The smell of ancient secrets. The smoke is thick and choking, blocking out the stars. It is a scene of apocalyptic beauty. The orange light reflects off the wet stones of the city walls, turning the night into a hallucinatory noon. The defenders on the walls watch in awe, crossing themselves, believing that God has sent angels with flaming swords to protect them. But it is not angels. It is chemistry. Historians and scientists still argue passionately about what Greek fire actually was. It is one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. We know it was invented by a refugee architect named Callinicus of Heliopolis, but the recipe was the most closely guarded state secret in the history of the world. The Byzantine emperors understood that this weapon was the only thing keeping their empire alive. They created a mythology around it, claiming an angel whispered the formula to Constantine the Great. The secret was compartmentalized in a way that would impress a modern intelligence agency. The men who harvested the ingredients did not know how to mix them. The men who mixed them did not know how to pressurize the pumps. If a commander was captured, he could not reveal the secret because he did not know it. Modern chemists suspect it was a mixture of naphtha, a light petroleum, quicklime, which heats up when it hits water, sulphur, and pine resin to make it sticky. But no one has ever perfectly recreated it. It remains a ghost technology, lost to the flames it created. The psychological impact of Greek fire cannot be overstated. It changed the way sailors looked at the horizon. Every approaching ship could be a dragon. The weapon was not just a flamethrower, it was a psychological wall. It bought the Byzantine Empire 500 extra years of life. Armies that saw the sky turn orange turned their ships around and went home, deciding that fighting men was one thing, but fighting liquid hell was another. There is a dark, almost slapstick comedy to be found in the countermeasures enemies tried to invent. Since water failed, rumours spread that only extraordinary liquids could douse the flames. Armies began stocking vinegar. They collected old urine, believing the ammonia would choke the fire. Imagine the scene. Terrifying warriors, conquerors of nations, frantically trying to pee on a burning deck in the middle of a battle. It captures the desperate absurdity of medieval warfare, where superstition and survival instinct collided. But the fire was not just for ships. Smaller, handheld versions, the Kiro siphoned, were used on siege towers, Imagine a soldier climbing a ladder, expecting a sword fight, only to be met by a man holding a bronze tube that spews a jet of flame into his face. It was the medieval equivalent of a shotgun, a weapon of terror that cleared the ramparts in seconds. The sound of the siphons, a rhythmic whoosh whoosh, became the heartbeat of the defence. It was the sound of technology triumphing over numbers. Yet, like all terrors, it had its limits. It was temperamental. It could not be used in a strong headwind, or the fire would blow back onto the user. It required calm seas. And eventually, the secret was lost, not stolen, simply forgotten. As the empire crumbled, the bureaucracy that maintained the supply chain broke down. The specific type of resin, the exact temperature of the distillation, the design of the bronze pump, it all faded into obscurity. By the time the Crusaders arrived, Greek fire was a legend, a story old men told to frighten children. But tonight, in our story, the fire is still burning. The Arab fleet is in retreat, their ships turning into charred skeletons drifting on the current. The Golden Horn is quiet again, save for the crackling of drifting timber. The water, which usually heals the scars of battle by washing them away, is stained with soot and oil. You can smell the victory from the walls. It smells like a thunderstorm and a forest fire mixed together. The defenders lean on their spears, exhausted, their faces smeared with soot, watching the orange glow fade into the dark blue of the pre-dawn. They have survived the night, they have survived the siege, but they know that the fire is a fickle servant. It burns the enemy today, but it can burn the city tomorrow if the wind changes. The existence of Greek fire reminds us that the Middle Ages were not just a time of mud and ignorance. They were a time of alchemy and engineering, where men manipulated the elements to create miracles. The liquid fire was a terrifying proof that the mind is the most dangerous weapon of all. As the last flame hisses and dies in the water, leaving a curl of white steam rising into the cold air, we turn away from the heat. The city is safe for now, but safety has a cost. The walls are still surrounded, and as the fire fades, the cold reality of the siege returns. The food is still low. The water is still rationed. And inside the city, a new kind of tragedy is brewing. Not a tragedy of chemistry, but a tragedy of the heart. We must move from the triumph of the machine to the failure of mercy, to the moment when the city decides who is worth saving and who is not. The fire on the water fades into memory, and the smoke clears to reveal a scene far colder and more intimate than the clash of navies. We return to the stone city, where the siege has dragged on, past the point of heroism, past the point of rationing, and into the realm of a terrible, quiet calculus. The granaries are sweeping the floor for dust. The rats are gone, eaten. The leather is being boiled. And now, the city council gathers in a dimly lit room to make the hardest decision in the history of warfare. They are not discussing tactics or surrender. They are discussing the bouches inutiles, the useless mouths. It is a term of chilling bureaucratic efficiency, a label that strips a human being of their soul and weighs them only by their appetite. A useless mouth is anyone who cannot hold a spear, draw a bow, or hammer iron. It is the elderly woman who tells stories by the fire. It is the cripple who begs at the church door. It is the orphan. It is, in the eyes of the siege ledger, a leak in the water bucket that must be plugged. The logic is brutal, but irrefutable in the minds of the commanders. If these people stay, everyone dies of starvation. If they go, the garrison might live long enough to be rescued. It is the arithmetic of the lifeboat applied to a metropolis. The proclamation is read quietly, or sometimes there is no proclamation at all, just a knock on the door in the middle of the night. The selected are told to gather at the postern gate. They are told a lie, a soft mercy, to keep them moving. The enemy will let you pass. They are Christians. They will not war on widows and children. You will find food in the countryside. You can see them gathering in the pre-dawn mist, a ghostly procession of the weak. They clutch small bundles of clothes, a wooden spoon, perhaps a hidden coin. There is no weeping yet. They are too weak for hysteria. There is only a numb, shuffling obedience. The heavy bolts of the gate are drawn back, not to let relief in, but to push life out. The hinges groan, a sound that echoes like a judgment. The group is ushered out into the no man's land, the grassy slope between the city walls and the enemy trench. The gate slams shut behind them. The bolt slides home. They are locked out of their home. They walk forward towards the campfires of the besiegers, expecting mercy, but the besieging commander is playing the same game of mathematics. He knows that every mouth he feeds is one less day his army can fight. He knows that if he feeds these refugees, the city will simply send more. And so, he gives a command that is perhaps even crueler than the one given inside the walls. Turn them back. The archers on the enemy line step forward. They do not shoot to kill, they shoot to terrorize. Arrows thud into the ground at the feet of the refugees. The message is clear: we are not your saviors. Confused, terrified, the group turns back toward the city. They wave their hands at the sentries on the walls, their neighbors, their brothers. Let us back in. They will not take us. But the walls remain silent. The faces of the defenders are turned away or hidden behind the stone merlons. The order has been given. The gate must not open. And so, the tragedy of the useless mouths begins. They are trapped in the ditch. They are citizens of nowhere, suspended in the killing field between two armies who have both decided they are already dead. This is not a hypothetical horror. It happened time and again. The most infamous instance occurred during the siege of Rouen in 1419, under the iron gaze of King Henry the Soft. 12,000 people were expelled from the city. Henry, a man of devout faith but absolute military resolve, refused to let them pass his lines. For weeks, in the freezing rain of a Norman winter, they lived in the muddy ditch. Historians recount scenes from that ditch that defy description. Women gave birth in the mud, and the infants were hauled up in baskets by ropes to be baptized by priests on the walls, only to be lowered back down to die with their mothers. It was a surreal ritual of salvation and damnation happening simultaneously. The people in the ditch ate grass, roots, and eventually the clothes off their backs. Above them, the city defenders threw down scraps when the officers weren't looking, but they could do little else. They had to listen to the voices of their own families slowly fading in the dark. There is a scholarly debate about the morality of the commanders in these situations. Was the city governor a monster for expelling them, or was he a pragmatist trying to save the soldiers who could actually win the war? Was the besieger a tyrant for refusing them passage? Or was he simply refusing to aid the enemy's strategy? The laws of chivalry, so often praised in songs, evaporated completely in the face of starvation. The useless mouths were not combatants, but they were not neutral. They were biological weapons. The city tried to use them to burden the enemy. The enemy used them to burden the city's conscience. The sensory reality of the ditch is something we must approach gently, for it is heavy. Imagine the smell of wet earth and sickness, the sound of rain falling on bodies that no longer shiver, the eerie quiet that settles over the group as the weeks pass. Yet even here, the human spirit flickers. Chroniclers mention acts of profound sacrifice. An old man giving his coat to a child who is not his own, a woman singing a lullaby that is too weak to reach the walls but strong enough to comfort the dying. They created a tiny tragic society in the shadow of the death that rejected them. In the end, at Rouen, when the city finally surrendered, The gates were opened, the soldiers marched out, heads high, but the survivors in the ditch, the few who remained, could not walk. They had to be carried. They were skeletons wrapped in skin, living accusations against the war that had discarded them. The useless mouths had spoken a truth louder than any trumpet. In a siege, the first thing to be starved is often not the stomach, but the capacity for mercy. As we leave the silence of the ditch, we carry with us the heavy knowledge that the wall is a double-edged sword. It protects, yes, but it also divides. And sometimes the most dangerous place to be is not on the ramparts, but on the wrong side of the door, when the lock turns. The wind blows over the unmarked graves of the exiles, rustling the grass that has grown tall and green, fed by the sorrow of the winter, and we move inward, back through the gate, to see what happens to those who stayed behind, those who were useful, but who are now facing a hunger so deep it threatens to consume their very humanity. The heavy wooden gate has been barred again, shutting out the weeping of the exiles in the ditch, and the city turns back to its own slow, quiet dying. We are now in the phase of the siege known as the hollow time. The panic of the first weeks has burned itself out, replaced by a strange, floating lethargy. The streets are empty, not because of curfew, but because movement costs energy, and energy is the only currency left. We drift into the kitchens of the great houses and the hovels alike, and we find the hearths are cold. There is no wood left to burn. The fences, the furniture, and even the floorboards have long since been fed to the fires to boil water. And in the pots, bubbling over the last embers of a chair leg, are things that were never meant to be eaten. This is the chapter of culinary desperation. History is full of menus from sieges, and they read like a descent into madness. At first, it was the horses, then the donkeys and mules, then the dogs and cats. There is a grim economic reality to the rat market that springs up in every besieged city. A fat rat, once a symbol of filth, becomes a luxury item, traded for a bag of gold or a diamond ring. During the siege of Paris in 1590, chroniclers recorded the precise price of a rat, noting that the rich would season them with heavy spices to mask the taste of the gutter. But we are past the rats now. The rats were smart. They left or were eaten months ago. Now, the people are looking at the inanimate objects around them with a predatory gaze. We watch a man sitting by a weak fire, holding a heavy leather belt. He is not putting it on. He is cutting it into strips. This is the reality of the Cordovan stew. Leather in the Middle Ages was tanned using natural processes, often involving urine and oak bark, but it was still, fundamentally, animal skin. It contained protein. The preparation was a ritual of patience. The leather, be it a belt, a shoe, or the cover of a shield, had to be soaked for days to soften it. Then it was scraped to remove the dyes and the wax. Finally, it was boiled. It was boiled for hours, rolling in the water until it turned into a grey, gelatinous glue. It did not taste like meat. It tasted of tannins and earth. It was chewy, rubbery, and rebellious in the mouth, requiring hours of chewing that the jaw muscles could barely sustain, but it filled the stomach. It stopped the cramping, if only for an hour. Historians often debate the nutritional value of these desperate meals. Modern science tells us that boiled leather provides almost no usable calories. The protein is denatured and locked in complex collagen structures the stomach cannot break down. It was a placebo meal. It fooled the body into thinking it had eaten while the muscles continued to waste away. Yet, in the psychological war of the siege, the feeling of a full stomach was worth almost as much as the reality. In the monasteries and scriptoriums, a different kind of consumption was taking place. Starving monks, guardians of knowledge, faced a terrible choice. Parchment, vellum, is made from the skin of calves and sheep. It is, in its essence, dried meat. We have accounts of monks soaking the pages of illuminated manuscripts, scrubbing away the holy words and the gold leaf, and boiling the skin to make a thin, milky broth. Imagine the symbolism. Eating the words of the saints to keep the body alive for one more day. The history of the world was literally being digested. How many lost plays of Aristophanes, how many records of forgotten kings ended up in the soup bowls of a besieged city? It gives a new literal meaning to the phrase devouring a book. As the bodies withered, the minds began to untether. Starvation induces a state of lucid hallucination. The brain, starved of sugar, begins to misfire. The defenders on the walls reported seeing armies of angels in the clouds or phantom fleets of ships arriving with grain. The line between faith and delirium vanished. The churches were packed, not just for mass, but because people wanted to die near God. They brought out the reliquaries, the bones of martyrs, the splinters of the true cross, and paraded them through the streets. They weren't asking for victory anymore. They were asking for an end. The prayers were a low, constant drone, a sound that competed with the wind. Give us this day our daily bread was no longer a metaphor. It was a specific, desperate request for a single loaf. There is a historical account from the siege of Jerusalem in 1099 regarding the Tafurs, a band of crusaders so poor and starving that they reportedly resorted to cannibalism, not out of malice, but out of a complete collapse of social taboo. While historians argue over the extent of this, whether it was truth or enemy propaganda designed to make the crusaders look like monsters, the fear of it was real. In the darkest corners of the besieged city, people eyed each other with a mixture of pity and hunger. The social contract, the invisible agreement that says, "I will not eat you," hangs by a thread when the granary is empty. Yet, amidst the horror of boiled boots and hallucinatory prayers, there were moments of staggering humanity. We read of mothers chewing the tough leather scraps to soften them before giving them to their children, acting as a living millstone. We read of soldiers on the wall sharing their last ration of biscuit, a rock-hard puck of baked flour and water, with a stray dog, simply because the dog looked lonely. The shared suffering created a strange equality. The nobleman's stomach hurt just as much as the beggar's. The silk robe hung just as loosely on the countess as the wool tunic did on the peasant. The siege was the great leveller. The atmosphere in the city during this phase is one of sensory deprivation. The smells are gone. The noise is gone. The colours seem to fade as the eyes weaken. The world becomes grey and quiet. The only sound is the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the enemy trebuchets, which has become so constant it is ignored, like a heartbeat. The people are waiting. They are waiting for the king to come. They are waiting for the walls to fall. They are waiting to die. They have done everything humanly possible. They have eaten their shoes. They have eaten their history. They have prayed until their throats are dry. And now, into this silence, a new sound begins to drift over the walls. It is not the crash of stones. It is music. The enemy outside, well-fed and bored, has decided that starvation is too slow. They want to break the spirit. They want to turn the hallucinations against the defenders. We move now from the physical torture of the empty stomach to the psychological torture of the sleepless mind, as the besiegers begin the theatre of fear. The silence of the starvation is not allowed to last. Just as the defenders drift into the numb, semi-conscious dozing that passes for sleep in a famine, the night is shattered by a cacophony that has nothing to do with war and everything to do with madness. We have entered the theatre of fear, the phase of the siege where the battlefield transforms into a stage and the enemy commander becomes a sadistic director. The weapon now is not a stone or a fire pot. It is a drum. Down in the enemy camp, the order has been given to wake the wall. Hundreds of drummers gather in the darkness just out of bowshot. At a signal, they begin to beat, a slow, rhythmic, pounding thud that vibrates in the chest. Then come the trumpets, blaring discordant, jarring notes designed not to inspire, but to irritate. Soldiers clash their swords against their shields. They scream insults. They howl like wolves. The goal is simple and biologically devastating. Sleep deprivation. The human mind can withstand hunger for weeks, but take away sleep for 3 days, and reality begins to fracture. Paranoia sets in. Shadows begin to move. A tired sentry is a useless sentry. He will hallucinate an attack where there is none, or worse, sleep through a real one. The psychological warfare of the Middle Ages was surprisingly sophisticated. Historians often marvel at how closely it mirrors modern psyops. The besiegers understood that a city was a pressure cooker, and they just needed to turn up the heat to make it explode from the inside. They staged elaborate feasts in full view of the walls. Imagine standing on the ramparts, your stomach cramping around a piece of boiled leather, looking down to see the enemy officers sitting at long tables draped in white linen. You see the steam rising from roasted capons. You see the glint of wine in crystal goblets. You can smell, or you think you can smell, which is just as painful, the aroma of garlic and rosemary drifting on the breeze. They eat slowly, exaggeratedly, toasting the starving wretches on the wall. It is a torture of proximity. It is designed to make you hate your own leaders. Why am I starving for the Duke? The soldier thinks, when I could be down there eating a chicken leg. But the theatre could turn from mocking to macabre in an instant. We must look now at the malvoisin, or the bad neighbour. This was a nickname often given to a siege tower or a specific trebuchet, but it represented the proximity of threat. The bad neighbour was there to deliver the most personal messages. At the siege of Nicaea in 1097 and later at Antioch, the Crusaders engaged in a gruesome exchange of mail. They decapitated the Turkish soldiers they had killed in skirmishes, but they did not bury the heads. They loaded them into the slings of the trebuchets. For the defenders inside, the horror was specific. You are watching the sky, expecting a stone, and instead a human head comes tumbling over the parapet. It rolls to a stop at your feet, and you recognize it. It is the baker from down the street. It is your cousin who went out on a sortie yesterday. This was the true terror of the headshot. It was not just about the gore. It was about the identification. It was a message. This is what happens to those who leave. This is what you will look like tomorrow. There is a scholarly debate about the frequency of such atrocities. Some Victorian historians tried to downplay them, calling them exaggerations of Dark Age chroniclers, but the sheer number of independent accounts from Muslim, Christian, and Chinese sources confirms that the weaponization of the corpse was a standard, if horrific, tool of the trade. It served a dual purpose: terror and disease. A rotting head is a biological grenade. Yet the defenders were not always passive victims in this theatre. They had their own script. In a display of bravado warfare, starving cities would sometimes throw their last fresh food over the wall to trick the besiegers. There is a famous legend from the siege of Carcassonne, where the Lady Carcass, with the city on the brink of starvation, took the last pig and fed it the last sack of grain. She then threw the fat, well-fed pig over the wall. The besiegers, seeing the animal burst open to reveal a stomach full of grain, despaired. They have so much food. They are throwing pigs at us. The siege was lifted. While likely a myth, the story captures the essential truth of siege psychology. It is a poker game. You have to bluff. You have to convince the enemy that you can wait forever, even when you have nothing left but a single pig and a lot of nerve. Sometimes the psychological war was personal. We have accounts of individual duels of wit. A besieger might ride up to the wall every morning in golden armour, shouting challenges, calling the defenders cowards, insulting their wives. He becomes a character in their lives, a daily villain. The defenders hate him, but they also watch for him. One day, a crossbowman on the wall, perhaps a man named Silent John, who hasn't spoken in weeks, decides he has heard enough. He spends all morning winding his windlass, selecting his best bolt, waiting for the wind to die down. The golden knight rides out for his daily monologue. Twang, the bolt flies, the night falls. A cheer goes up from the wall, a ragged horse cheer, but a genuine one. For a moment the morale shifts. The giant has fallen. Soft humour returns. The defenders joke that he finally shut his mouth. These small victories were the oxygen that kept the dying city breathing. But the darkest part of the theatre was the parade of the hopeless. The besiegers would sometimes round up prisoners, captured messengers or foraging parties, and bring them to the edge of the moat. They would not kill them immediately. They would torture them in full view and earshot of their families on the wall. They would force them to plead, "Open the gate, father. They will stop if you open the gate." This was the ultimate test of the commander's resolve. To hold the wall, he had to watch his own people suffer and do nothing. He had to harden his heart into stone. This is why siege commanders were often hated by their own citizens as much as by the enemy. They were the jailers who refused to hand over the keys. As the night wears on, the drumming continues. Thump, thump, thump. It weaves into the dreams of the children who dream of marching giants. The city is fraying. The unity that held them together in the beginning is gone. The neighbours are looking at each other with suspicion. Is he hiding bread? Is he planning to open the gate? The enemy has succeeded. They have planted the seed of treason in the dark soil of fear. The walls are still standing, but the people behind them are cracking. And as we will see, it is often not the battering ram that breaks the city, but the whisper of a deal, the clink of gold in a dark alley, and the betrayal of a brother. The stage is set for the Fourth Crusade, where the theatre of war turns into a tragedy of greed. We step away from the dark mud of the trenches and the grim theatre of the starving camps, and we find ourselves in a place where the light dances on the water and the air smells of salt, spices, and immense wealth. We are in Venice. The year is 1202. The siege we are about to witness is not born of hatred or territory or religion. It is born of a ledger. It is a siege of accounting. History often teaches us that wars are fought for glory or God, but the Fourth Crusade teaches a colder, harder lesson. Sometimes a city burned simply to balance a checkbook. The Crusaders, thousands of knights in shining mail, burning with holy zeal to reclaim Jerusalem, have arrived in Venice to find their transport ships waiting. But there is a problem. A catastrophic miscalculation has occurred. The leaders of the crusade had ordered a fleet for an army of 30,000. Only 12,000 have shown up. The Venetians, the supreme merchants of the medieval world, have built the ships. They have suspended all commerce for a year to fulfill this contract, and now they want to be paid. The price is 85,000 silver marks, a sum so staggering it could bankrupt a kingdom. The Crusaders empty their pockets. They melt down their silver plate. They beg and borrow, but they are still short. They are trapped on the island of the Lido, effectively prisoners of their own debt, staring at the magnificent fleet they cannot afford to board. Enter the Doge, Enrico Dandolo. He is over 90 years old and completely blind, yet he sees the geopolitical board more clearly than any man with eyes. He is a figure of terrifying intellect and pragmatism, He makes the Crusaders an offer that will stain the soul of Christendom forever. He will suspend the debt. He will transport them. He will even join them. But first, they must do a small favour for Venice. There is a city down the coast of the Adriatic, a rival trading port that has been troublesome. Its name is Zara. Help us reclaim Zara, the blind doge whispers, and we will sail for the Holy Land. The Crusaders are horrified. Zara is a Christian city. It belongs to the King of Hungary, who is himself a Crusader, in name at least. To attack it would be a sin of the highest order. The Pope, Innocent III, hears of the plan and sends a furious letter forbidding it under pain of excommunication. But the Doge knows something about human nature. A man with a debt is a man who can be bought. The Crusaders are desperate. They are starving on the Lido. Their holy mission is stalling before it has even begun. And so, with heavy hearts and rationalized consciences, they agree. The army of God becomes a foreclosure crew. The fleet sets sail in October. It is a spectacle of naval power such as the world has rarely seen. Hundreds of galleys, their sails painted with the Red Cross, their decks crowded with the finest warriors in Europe. As they slice through the blue waters of the Adriatic, the irony is thick enough to choke on. These men took a vow to kill infidels, yet their prows are pointed at a Catholic cathedral. When the fleet arrives at Zara, modern-day Zadar in Croatia, the people of the city are terrified. They see the crosses on the sails and think, surely there is a mistake. We are on the same side. In a desperate, visually haunting attempt to save themselves, the people of Zara hang crosses over the walls. They drape banners of the Virgin Mary from the battlements. It is a plea in the universal language of their faith. We are Christians. Do not shoot. Imagine standing on the deck of a Venetian galley, looking up at those crosses hanging against the white stone. You are a knight who swore to defend the cross, and now you are loading a catapult to smash it. The cognitive dissonance is deafening, but the Doge is unmoved. He is not here for theology. He is here for the interest on his loan. The order is given. The siege begins. It is a short, brutal affair. The Venetian navy breaks the harbour chain, a heavy iron boom floating on logs, and the Crusaders land their siege engines. The trebuchets, which were meant to batter the walls of Jerusalem, are set up to batter the walls of a friendly neighbour. The mining teams, who were meant to undermine the Saracens, begin to dig under the foundations of Hungarian churches. Historians often pause here to debate the nature of holy war. Zara is the moment the mask slips. It reveals that the logistics of medieval warfare had become so expensive, so complex, that they eclipsed the ideology. The machine of war was so hungry for gold that it would eat its own children to feed itself. The Crusaders were no longer autonomous soldiers of faith. They were employees of the Venetian Republic. Inside the city, the Zaratines fought bravely, but they were doomed. They were fighting the greatest army in the world, an army that was fighting for its own survival. If the Crusaders didn't take Zara, they didn't eat. It was a siege driven by the panic of the attacker, not just the defender. After 5 days of bombardment, the walls were breached, the city surrendered, and then came the sack. It was disciplined, but thorough. The Venetians took the half of the booty that was owed to them. The Crusaders took the rest to pay off the balance. The city was stripped. But the tragedy did not end with the looting. Winter was coming. The fleet could not sail for Egypt or the Holy Land in the storms of November. So, the Crusaders and the Venetians decided to winter in the ruins of the city they had just destroyed. Imagine the atmosphere in Zara that winter. The conquerors moving into the houses of the people they had just robbed. The awkward, hostile silence in the streets. The Pope, true to his word, excommunicated the entire crusade. They were cast out of the church, damned souls on a holy mission. The soldiers were terrified. They were supposed to be earning salvation, and instead they had earned hellfire. The leaders, desperate to keep the army together, largely hid the letter of excommunication from the common soldiers, telling them it was all a misunderstanding. It was a winter of lies, guilt, and cold winds blowing off the Adriatic. Yet, even in this moral abyss, the logic of the siege held firm. The Venetians used the downtime to repair their ships and their siege engines. They treated the war like a business trip that had hit a snag. The blind Doge Dandolo, despite his age, was the most energetic man in the camp, already planning the next move. He knew that Zara was not enough. The debt was technically serviced, but the appetite for wealth had been whetted. There was a bigger prize to the east, a city made of gold that had tempted men for centuries. A deposed Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, had arrived in the camp with a sob story and a promise. "Put me back on the throne of Constantinople and I will pay you 200,000 silver marks." The number hung in the air like a fever dream. 200,000 marks. It was enough to pay the debt twice over. It was enough to make every man in the army rich. The moral compass, already spun wild at Zara, now shattered completely. The crusade was now a gun for hire. The siege of Zara had been the training ground, the moment where the army learned to ignore the cross on the wall if the coin was heavy enough. They packed their tents. They loaded the stolen goods of Zara into the holds. They left the broken city behind, a smoking warning to the world that a siege army has no friends, only targets. As the fleet turned south and east, navigating the islands of Greece, a dark anticipation builds. They are sailing toward the greatest siege in medieval history. The siege of Zara was a tragedy. What comes next is a catastrophe. We leave the Adriatic behind, the water churning in the wake of the galleys, and we look ahead to the Golden Horn, where the walls of Theodosius, the walls that stopped the Huns, the Arabs and the Bulgars, are waiting for the men who carry the cross. The lesson of Zara is etched into the wood of the ships. Loyalty is expensive, but a siege engine is a tool that asks no questions. The wind fills the sails, pushing the fleet toward a destiny that will extinguish the light of the ancient world, and we realize that the most dangerous siege is the one where the attackers have sold their souls before they even reach the gate. The wind carries us forward through the centuries, past the age of the trebuchet and the arrow, to a spring morning in 1453 where the air is heavy with a new and terrifying scent. It smells of sulphur, charcoal, and saltpeter, the devil's incense. We stand before the greatest fortifications ever built by human hands, the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. For 1,000 years, these walls have been the horizon of the civilized world. They are a triple layer of limestone and brick, rising like a man-made mountain range, protected by a deep moat and studded with 96 towers. They stopped Attila the Hun, they stopped the Arabs, they stopped the Bulgars. To the medieval mind, they are not just walls, they are a physical law of the universe, an immutable fact that says, this far and no further. But history is about to break that law. Sitting outside these ancient walls, in the sprawling tent city of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, lies a metal beast sleeping in the mud. It is a cannon, but to call it a cannon is like calling a hurricane a breeze. It is the basilic, the royal gun, a bronze tube 27 feet long, so massive that a man could crawl down its barrel on his hands and knees. The story of this weapon is one of the great tragic ironies of history. It begins with a Hungarian engineer named Orban, a man of dark genius who wandered into Constantinople months earlier looking for work. He offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine II. He told the emperor he could build a gun that would blast the Turks to the moon. The emperor, a noble man ruling a bankrupt empire, looked at his empty treasury and had to refuse. He could barely pay for food, let alone experimental artillery. So, Orban packed his bags, walked out the gate, and walked straight into the camp of the young Sultan Mehmed. He asked Mehmed if he could cast a cannon strong enough to shatter the walls of Babylon. Mehmed, flush with the wealth of a rising empire, asked only one question: how much? Orban was hired. The weapon that would destroy the city was bought with the gold the city didn't have. The logistics of the basilic were a siege in themselves. It was cast in Adrianople and dragged to Constantinople by 60 oxen and 400 men, a slow, groaning procession that smoothed the roads of Thrace. It was not just a weapon, it was a pilgrimage of destruction. Now, it sits pointed at the gate of St. Romanus. The preparation to fire it is a ritual that takes hours. We watch the gunners, stripped to the waist, sweating in the cool April air. They pour in the powder, black, coarse grains that look like crushed beetles. They pack it with a wad of wood and sheepskin to create the seal. Then comes the stone. It is a marble sphere weighing 1,500 pounds, the size of a waist-high globe. It takes a system of pulleys and cranes just to lift it into the mouth of the bronze dragon. The defenders on the walls watch this activity with a cold knot in their stomachs. They have seen cannons before, small, noisy things that scared horses but barely scratched stone. They do not understand the scale of what is coming. The master gunner lights the match. The fuse hisses, a tiny snake of fire racing toward the breach. There is a moment of absolute silence, where even the birds seem to stop singing. And then the world ends. The sound is not heard. It is felt. It is a physical blow to the chest. The chronicles say the roar was heard across the Bosphorus, 10 miles away. The ground shakes as if an earthquake has struck. A massive cloud of white smoke, thick and acrid, erupts from the barrel, blinding the gunners. And out of that cloud comes the stone. It does not arc gracefully like a trebuchet shot. It flies flat and fast, a blur of grey violence. It strikes the wall. The impact is terrifying. Stone does not crack, it disintegrates. The ancient limestone, which has weathered a millennium of storms, explodes into a cloud of dust and shrapnel. A section of the wall simply vanishes, replaced by a gaping hole and a pile of rubble. The defenders are thrown from their feet by the shockwave. Women in the city faint from the sheer concussive force. This is the moment the castle age dies. For thousands of years, the vertical wall was the ultimate defence. If you built it high enough and thick enough, you were safe. But in 1 second, the mathematics of war have changed. Vertical stone is no longer a shield, it is a target. The energy of the gunpowder is too great. The wall has met a force it cannot absorb. But the basilic has a weakness. It is a beast that overheats. After each shot, the bronze glows cherry red. If they reload it now, the powder will ignite instantly, killing the crew, so they must wait. They pour buckets of olive oil over the barrel to cool it, the hot metal screaming as the oil vaporizes into a greasy, foul-smelling steam. The great gun can only be fired 7 times a day. It is a slow, rhythmic doom. Boom. Wait 3 hours. Boom. Wait 3 hours. This gives the defenders a sliver of hope. Historians often focus on the destruction, but the true heroism of the siege lies in the gaps between the shots. The moment the dust settles, the people of Constantinople rush into the breach. Not just soldiers, but monks, nuns, and children. They carry baskets of earth, bales of wool and timber. They cannot rebuild the stone wall. There is no time for mortar to set. So they build a stockade, a soft wall of earth and wood. And here is the fascinating physics of the siege. The soft wall works better. When the next cannonball hits the earth mound, it doesn't shatter anything. It simply buries itself in the dirt. The energy is absorbed. The city is surviving by becoming softer, not harder. The psychological toll of the bombardment is relentless. It is the first time in the history a city has been subjected to continuous thunder. The defenders cannot sleep. The noise rattles their teeth and frays their nerves. They give the cannon nicknames, calling it the bear or the monster. They try to counter it with their own small cannons, but the vibrations from their own guns threaten to shake their crumbling walls apart. So they are forced to stop. They are silenced by the fragility of their own defences. Inside the city, the Emperor Constantine fights with a desperate, quiet dignity. He knows the end is coming. He melts down the silver lamps of the Hagia Sophia to pay the soldiers. He walks the walls at night, listening to the enemy digging in the dark, listening to the murmurs of his starving people. There is a scholarly debate about the role of the Kerker Porta, a small postern gate that was allegedly left unlocked by accident, allowing the Turks to enter. Some say it was treachery, others say it was simple exhaustion. But the truth is, the cannons made the gates irrelevant. The wall itself was becoming a gate. As the weeks drag on, the piles of rubble grow higher. The moat is filled with debris, creating a bridge for the attackers. The great towers, which once looked down on the world with arrogance, are now jagged stumps. The landscape of the siege has changed. It is no longer a clean line of stone against green fields. It is a chaotic, dusty scar of grey and brown. The sensory experience is one of choking dust. It coats the tongue, the eyes, the water. It is the dust of history being ground down. The great bombard eventually cracks. The immense pressure is too much for the bronze, and fissures appear in the barrel. Auburn tries to band it with iron hoops, but the beast is dying. Yet it has done its work. It has proven that the era of the stone fortress is over. It has shouted a message to every king in Europe. Your walls are paper. The security of the medieval world has evaporated in a cloud of sulphur smoke. Night falls on May 28th. The bombardment stops. A strange silence descends on the camp of the Sultan. It is not the silence of peace, it is the silence of the breath before the scream. The defenders look out from their broken walls and see thousands of torches being lit. They hear the chanting of prayers. They know that tomorrow the stone will not need to be broken because the human wave is coming. The basilic sits cooling in the dark, a silent monument to the new age, its mouth black with soot, having thundered the Middle Ages into oblivion. We hold our breath with the last Roman emperor, standing in the rubble of 1,000 years, waiting for the sun to rise on a world that will never be the same again. The silence of the night does not break, it shatters. It is May 29th, 1453, a Tuesday, a day that Greeks will consider unlucky for centuries to come. The first light of dawn has not yet touched the Golden Horn, but the darkness is already alive. From the Ottoman camp, a sound rises that is more terrifying than the cannons. It is the sound of the zurna and the davul, the shrill nasal oboes, and the deep booming drums of the Janissary bands. They are playing the music of the end. And then the human voice joins the instruments. Tens of thousands of throats scream a single word, Allah, rolling toward the broken walls like a physical wave of pressure. The final assault has begun. We are standing in the Lycus Valley, the lowest point of the terrain where the walls are most ruined. This is the wound in the city's side. The defenders, exhausted, bleary-eyed and starving, clutch their weapons. They have been repairing the stockade all night, their hands raw and bleeding. They look out into the gloom and see the first wave rushing toward them. These are the Bashi bazooks, the irregulars, a chaotic mix of mercenaries, adventurers, and cannon fodder. They scream, they run, they die. They are not meant to take the wall, they are meant to tire the arms of the defenders, and they do. For 2 hours, the Byzantines hack and stab, fighting In a cloud of dust and adrenaline, the moat fills with bodies. The defenders are winning, but they are spending the only currency they have left, their energy. Then the Sultan sends the second wave, the Anatolian infantry. These are disciplined, armoured and fresh. The defenders, now gasping for breath, their muscles burning with lactic acid, must lift their heavy shields again. The combat is intimate and horrific. It is a crush. There is no room to swing a long sword. Men are stabbing with daggers, punching with gauntleted fists, biting. The dust from the pulverized walls hangs in the air, a thick, choking fog that coats the inside of the throat with the taste of limestone and blood. You cannot see the sun. You can only see the flash of steel and the desperate faces of the men trying to kill you. But the wall holds, the stockade holds. The Emperor Constantine is there, in the thick of it, shouting encouragement, a purple cloak flashing in the dust, like a beacon. For a brief, insane moment, it seems possible that the impossible might happen, that they might survive. And then, history turns on a hinge of pure bad luck. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, the tactical genius who has held the defence together for weeks, is struck. Historians debate the projectile. Was it a crossbow bolt? A bullet from a handgun? Fragments of a cannonball? It pierces his armour, shattering his shoulder and his chest. He falls. The pain is blinding. He asks to be taken off the wall to his ship to be treated. The Emperor begs him to stay. "My brother, do not leave us. Your wound is slight." But the pain is too much. Giustiniani insists. The little gate in the inner wall is opened to let his stretcher through. This is the moment. This is the heartbeat where the city dies. The defenders see the gate open. They see their leader leaving. They see the blood. A whisper races down the line, faster than the wind. "The city is lost. Run!" The psychological wall collapses before the stone one does. The panic is infectious. Men who stood firm against the cannons now throw down their spears and turn to flee toward the harbour. The discipline evaporates. And at that exact second, the Sultan plays his final card. The Janissaries, the elite guard, the sons of Christians raised as Muslim warriors, the finest soldiers in the world. They have been waiting in silence, watching. Now they charge. They do not scream. They move with terrifying rhythmic precision. They hit the weakened stockade like a sledgehammer. One giant janissary climbs the debris, planting a flag on the top of the rampart. He is cut down, but another takes his place, and another. They are over. The breach is open. The enemy pours through, not like an army, but like water bursting a dam. The pressure is irresistible. The defenders are pushed back, trampled, crushed against the inner walls. The noise is deafening. The clash of metal, the screams of the dying, the roar of the drums. It is a sensory overload of violence. In the midst of this chaos, we see the Emperor. Constantine the Fiend knows that the game is over. The Empire of Rome, which has stood for 1,500 years, is ending in the next 10 minutes. He makes a choice that elevates him from a politician to a legend. He throws off his purple imperial regalia, the symbols of his office that might make him a valuable prisoner. He keeps only his sword and his red boots. He turns to his remaining handful of loyal knights. "The city has fallen," he shouts, "and I am still alive." It is a cry of defiance and shame. He plunges into the oncoming tide of janissaries. He is not fighting to win, he is fighting to die. Historians still debate his fate. His body was never formally identified. Some say he was buried in a mass grave. Some say his head was cut off and stuffed with straw. Some say he turned to marble and sleeps under the Golden Gate, waiting to wake up. But the truth is more poignant. He vanished into the dust of his own city. He became part of the rubble. He died as a soldier, indistinguishable from the common men he led. The scene at the breach slows down now. The dust is so thick it looks like twilight. The Turks are flooding into the streets. The defenders are dead or fleeing. The great gates of the city, locked for weeks, are now thrown open from the inside or smashed down. The iron horizon we spoke of at the beginning has been obliterated. The city is no longer an island. It is open. The air changes. It no longer smells of siege. It smells of conquest. But for the civilians hiding in the churches, the horror is just beginning. They hear the change in the noise. The rhythmic thumping of the cannons has stopped. The shouting is different now. It is closer. It is in the streets. Women clutch their children in the nave of the Hagia Sophia, praying for a miracle that will not come. The great bronze doors of the cathedral are barred, a final, futile gesture of protection. We linger for a moment at the breach, watching the flags of the Sultan rising over the towers. The sun is fully up now, illuminating the carnage. The moat is level with the ground, filled with the dead. The walls look like broken teeth. The moment is over. The transition is complete. The city has not just been defeated, it has been erased. The name Constantinople is already fading, making way for Istanbul. But the transition from war to peace does not happen instantly. First, there must be the payment. The army has been promised 3 days of plunder. The leash has been cut. The soldiers are running into the streets with empty sacks and hungry eyes. We must now turn our gaze from the broken wall to the broken home to witness the complex, brutal, and often misunderstood aftermath of the fall, the judgment of the victor. The battle is over, but the war has one final, terrible breath to exhale. The deafening roar of the cannons and the clash of steel has been replaced by a new soundscape, one that is more chaotic, more intimate, and in many ways, more frightening. It is the sound of a city being turned inside out. We are witnessing the sack, the derelip, the customary right of the medieval soldier to plunder a city that refused to surrender. It is a moment where the strict hierarchy of the army dissolves into a frenzy of individual greed. The janissary is no longer a disciplined shock trooper, he is a treasure hunter. The intricate social fabric of Constantinople, woven over 1,000 years, is being unravelled in a single afternoon. The streets are filled with a strange, terrified movement. Soldiers are running into houses, and civilians are running out of them or being dragged out. The air is thick with the dust of shattered doors and the smoke of small fires. But the focal point of this tragedy is the great cathedral, the Hagia Sophia. For centuries, it was the spiritual anchor of the East, a building so beautiful that visitors said it hung from heaven by a golden chain. Now, the huge bronze doors are vibrating. Inside, thousands of people, the elderly, the women, the children, the priests, are huddled in the dark, lit only by the flickering lamps of the altar. They are singing. It is a desperate, wall-shaking chant of Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. They are waiting for the angel of the prophecy, the one who was supposed to appear at the column of Constantine and drive the enemy back with a sword of fire. But the angel does not come. Instead, the axes come, the bronze doors groan under the assault, the wood splinters, and then, with a crash that echoes in the vast dome like thunder, the doors give way. The looting army spills into the sanctuary. The singing stops, replaced by screams. What follows is a collision of the sacred and the profane. The soldiers are dazzled by the wealth. They strip the silver sheathing from the icons. They tear the gold chalices from the hands of the priests. They hack pieces of the altar off to carry away as souvenirs. But the true loot is not the gold. It is the people. In the medieval economy of war, a human being is a liquid asset. The nuns, the daughters of nobles, the young boys, they are tied together with ropes, sometimes with their own veils or belts. families are separated in the chaos. A mother screams for her child as they are dragged to different ships destined for different slave markets in Cairo, Damascus, or Bursa. It is a moment of profound rupture. The genealogical lines of the Roman aristocracy are snapped. A duchess becomes a kitchen maid. A scholar becomes a rower in a galley. The human capital of the city is being liquidated. Historians often debate the ferocity of this sack. Christian chroniclers describe rivers of blood and total desecration. Ottoman sources describe a glorious, orderly transition. The truth, as always, is likely found in the dust between them. It was brutal, yes, but it was also transactional. Soldiers were seen checking the teeth of captives, assessing their value. Books, the priceless heritage of Greek antiquity, were largely ignored. There are heartbreaking accounts of soldiers burning manuscripts of Aristotle and Plato just to cook their meat, or selling 10 volumes of philosophy for a single coin. The intellectual wealth of the ancient world went up in smoke, not out of malice, but out of ignorance. To a starving soldier, a book is just fuel. And then, late in the afternoon, the chaos shifts again. A new figure rides through the breach. It is the Sultan, Mehmed II. He is only 21 years old. He rides a white horse, and as he enters the city of his dreams, he does not shout in triumph. He is silent. He looks at the ruins of the Caesars. He looks at the broken columns and the headless statues. He is a man of deep culture, fluent in languages, a student of history. He knows what he has done. He has killed the past to birth the future. He rides to the Hagia Sophia. The looting is still ongoing. He dismounts and walks into the great cavern of the church. He sees a soldier hacking at the marble floor, trying to pry up a slab of stone. Mehmed strikes the man with the flat of his sword. "The people and the treasure are yours," he reportedly says, his voice echoing in the dome. "But the buildings are mine." It is the first act of the new order. He is claiming the stone. He walks to the altar, climbs upon it, and bows his head to the ground in prayer. In that single motion, the Hagia Sophia changes. It is no longer a church, it is a mosque. The transition is spiritual, architectural, and absolute. There's a famous melancholic story that as Mehmed walked through the ruined halls of the great palace later that day, observing the spider webs in the windows and the owl hooting in the royal towers, he recited a couplet of Persian poetry. The spider serves as the gatekeeper in the hall of Khosrow. The owl plays martial music in the castle of Afrasiab. It is a moment of haunting philosophical clarity. The victor stands on the ashes of the vanquished and realizes that time will eventually conquer him too. The siege has ended, not in a party, but in a meditation on mortality. Mehmed eventually orders the sack to stop. The custom allows for 3 days, but after 1 day, he has seen enough. The city is ruining his new capital. He sends the criers out. "Stop! Sheathe your swords! To your tents!" The discipline, broken for 24 hours, snaps back into place. The fires are doused. The captives are marched out. The silence returns to the streets. A heavy, stunned silence. The aftermath of the siege is a strange limbo. The city is empty. It is a shell. Mehmed realizes he has conquered a graveyard. He immediately begins the process of repopulation. He doesn't just want soldiers. He wants bakers, masons, Jews, Christians, artisans. He offers tax exemptions. He forces people from other conquered cities to move here. He is trying to jumpstart the heart of the dead metropolis. He is building Istanbul on top of Constantinople. The fall of the city sends a shockwave through Europe. The Pope calls for a new crusade, but no one answers. The kings of the West are too busy fighting each other. The iron horizon has moved. The buffer state is gone. The siege of Constantinople was the final exam of the Middle Ages. and Europe failed it. The canon has proven that the old world is obsolete. The feudal system, the stone castle, the isolated city-state, they are all dead, buried under the rubble of the Theodosian walls. As night falls on the first day of Ottoman Istanbul, the call to prayer rings out from the makeshift minarets. It is a new sound for the city, a high melodic chant that drifts over the Bosphorus. The water reflects the crescent moon. The dead are still being counted. The history books are being closed and reopened. The siege is over. The waiting is over. The hunger is over. All that remains is the memory of what was and the reality of what is. We stand on the Galata Tower, looking across the Golden Horn at the smoke rising from the city. We have journeyed from the first bolt sliding shut to the final door breaking open. We have seen the leather boiled, the tunnels dug, and the fire thrown. We have seen the endurance of the human spirit and the crushing weight of time. Now there is only one thing left to do. We must walk forward out of the year 1453 and into the quiet, overgrown present to see what remains of these great struggles. We must visit the ghosts. The smoke of Constantinople clears, and the great wheel of history turns once more, spinning faster now, blurring the days into years and the years into centuries. We step forward, out of the age of iron and stone, and into the quiet, sun-drenched stillness of the present day. We are standing on a grassy hill in France, or perhaps a rocky crag in Wales, or a dusty bluff in Syria. The location does not matter, for the ending is the same everywhere. Before us stands the ruin. The castle, once a terrifying machine of war, is now a shell. The walls that were built to stop armies have finally been breached, not by a trebuchet or a cannon, but by the patient, relentless siege of the ivy and the rain. This is the slow siege, the one that no fortress can win. Nature, the ultimate besieger, has reclaimed the ground. The moat, once a stagnant pit of fear, is now a ring of wildflowers and tall, swaying grass where children play. The drawbridge is gone, replaced by a wooden walkway for tourists. The murder holes, through which boiling water and arrows once rained, are now nesting places for pigeons and swallows, who fly in and out with a freedom that the soldiers of the past would have envied. There is a profound, heavy silence in these places. It is not an empty silence. It is a silence filled with the weight of what happened. You run your hand over the rough grey stone of the keep. It is warm in the sun. It feels solid, permanent, but if you look closely, you can see the scars. You can see the scorch marks from a fire set 500 years ago. You can see the pock marks where the musket balls struck. You can see the groove worn into the spiral staircase by the boots of generations of guards who walked up and down night after night, waiting for an enemy who is long dead. We walk through the roofless great hall, where the sky is the only ceiling. The hearth, where the leather was boiled and the desperate plans were laid, is cold. The acoustics of the room have changed. Once, it echoed with the shouts of commanders and the clashing of armour. Now, it holds only the sound of the wind whistling through the empty window arches, a low, mournful flute song that never ends. Modern tourism casts a strange, softening veil over these sites. We buy tickets at a kiosk. We eat ice cream in the shadow of the gatehouse. We listen to audio guides that reduce the starvation and the terror to interesting anecdotes. There is a scholarly term for this, managed decay. We curate the ruin. We keep the walls standing, just enough to be romantic, but not enough to be threatening. We forget that this picturesque pile of stones was once an industrial site of pain. We forget the useless mouths shivering in the ditch where the parking lot now sits. We forget the smell of the unburied dead. Time has washed the blood from the stones and left only the geometry. But if you stand very still, away from the crowds, you can almost sense the vibration of the past. The ghosts here are not spirits in sheets. They are the echoes of human endurance. They are the memory of the mother who saved a crust of bread for her child. They are the memory of the sapper who dug in the dark. They are the memory of the king who stood in the breach. The ruin teaches us the final lesson of the siege, that all walls are temporary. We build them to keep out the world, to protect what we have, to define us and them. We obsess over security, over borders, over the integrity of our own personal fortresses. But the earth does not care for our lines. The roots of the oak tree will eventually pry the stones apart. The frost will crack the mortar. The gravity that powered the trebuchet will eventually pull the tower down to the level of the field. There is a humility in this. It reminds us that our struggles, no matter how intense they feel in the moment, are brief flashes in the long night of history. The hunger passes, the fear passes. The conquerors and the conquered both return to the dust, leaving behind only the wind and the stone. Yet there is comfort here too. The castle fell, yes, the city was taken, but the humanity survived. The descendants of the people who starved in these towers are walking the earth today. The songs they sang in the dark are still hummed in nurseries. The stories they told are still whispered. The resilience of the human spirit proved to be stronger than the limestone. We look out from the ruined rampart one last time, watching the sun set over the peaceful landscape. The fires are out, the armies have gone home, the siege is over. The iron horizon has rusted away, leaving a view that stretches to the ends of the earth, open and free. The silence of the ruin is not the silence of death. It is the silence of peace after a long, hard struggle. The stone sleeps now, and so can we. And now, the journey is done. The portcullis is raised, and the gates are left wide open. The tension of the siege has dissolved into the cool, quiet air of the night. You can let your shoulders drop. You can unclench your hands. There are no more walls to defend, no more watchers to keep. The history has been told, and the figures of the past have returned to the mist, leaving you safe in the comfort of your own time, in the warmth of your own bed. The world outside is vast and calm. The only sound is the rhythm of your own breathing, slow and steady, like a tide that never fails. The battles are over. The stones have settled. The night is a blanket of soft velvet wrapping around you, protecting you, not with rock, but with peace. Let the story fade into a gentle hum. Let the images of towers and torches soften into the abstract colours of a dream. You are safe. You are warm. You are free. The past rests, and now, so do you. Sweet dreams.